Hello, everyone, and welcome to Building Alaska's Future Insights from Iceland. This virtual workshop is presented by the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in partnership with Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I'm Leasi Vanessa Lee Raymond for Alaska Center for Energy and Power's Deputy Director for Strategic Initiatives, and I will be your MC today. Thank you for joining us. Morning in Alaska, afternoon in Iceland. So this spring, ASEP is hosting a series of 4 virtual workshops held as 2 half-day Zoom sessions. They're free of charge, and they lead up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is taking place in person from June 3rd to June 5th at the Denina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. The purpose of these workshops is to take a deeper dive into the current relevance and specific topics of energy opportunities and challenges facing Alaska today. This workshop that you're at today is the second in a series, and we have 2 more coming up in May. And you'll see them on the screen there. The upcoming workshops include dueling over dual use infrastructure on May 6th through 7th. And then we have the IEEE 1547 Interconnection Standard, Enabler of Technical Innovation and End User Benefit on May 13th and 14th. This is the 4th year that ASEP has hosted these workshops, and we have brought some of the top experts and practitioners together from both inside Alaska and beyond, from other U.S. states, internationally, to present these workshops to provide Alaskan spin and to hear from speakers with information we think is highly relevant to an Alaskan audience, and today's session is no exception. Previous topics have included energy and cybersecurity, emerging energy technology, ocean and river energy, nuclear energy in Alaska, low carbon energy transitions, carbon capture and sequestration, and energy storage. All of our previous workshops have been recorded and they're accessible online. You can visit them on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website. We have posted a link in the chat in case you want to revisit any of those topics. So if you're interested in learning more from the perspective of what could work in Alaska, please click that link. It's still very relevant. So for today's workshop, Building Alaska's Future, Insights from Iceland, we'll be exploring what Alaska can learn from Iceland's example and vice versa. With so many overlapping energy concerns, industry needs, and a strong desire for tourism, these 2 very unique places have a lot of similarities, as well as some differences. Together, today, we'll explore the potential of partnerships and knowledge sharing, and we'll hear a little bit more about what's already happening in partnership between Alaska and Iceland from Dr. Gwen Holdman very shortly. On a recent energy policy and education tour in Iceland as part of the Arctic Energy Forum, I saw firsthand what Icelandic ingenuity and resourcefulness means, and I know what Alaskan ingenuity and resourcefulness means as well. Traveling through Iceland with a group of mostly Alaskans, we couldn't help but dream of the possibilities for Alaska, inspired by what we'd seen there. And I hope that's what happens for you today, too. So our conversation today is really framed around what we can learn from Iceland and what it means to establish procedures and best practices that are tailored to the Alaskan energy context. This morning, we will start by learning about Alaska's electric utility model for Alaska's rail belt grid, followed by an update on the formation of the Rail Belt Transmission Organization, or RTO. We will then have a panel discussion on what Alaska's energy utilities, microgrid operators, and energy planners for the state can gain from Icelandic partners. After the break, we'll explore the role of energy in data centers through a closer look at Iceland's energy-powered data center industry, a potential future revenue stream for Alaskan communities. What are the trade-offs? What are the lessons learned? We'll find out more in the panel discussion. So you see on the slide here, we're starting now, and we'll move through presentations and then panel conversation and repeat Tomorrow, the conversation continues as we will learn how Iceland built a thriving innovation economy. And then we'll close out day 2 with how Iceland has been so successful and what that could mean for Alaska. But before we get started, we have a few questions for the group to get to know one another and also for us to get to know you. To participate in today's polls from your computer, go to pollev.com/TOTTAK216. We recommend Google Chrome for best results, and the link for the poll is also in the chat. If you want to participate on your phone, you can text TOTTAK216 to 22333. You will receive a text message once you've joined the session. Type and send your response, and the results will pop up on the next screen. So the first thing we'd like to know is, where are you joining us from? So you'll just drop a pin in the map or circle where you're from. I see a bunch of people joining us from the US, but outside of Alaska. A few people from outside the US. Bunch of people from around the Anchorage area. Got Fairbanks and Juneau represented as well. Oh, and someone in Kodiak. Welcome, Kodiak. Wonderful. All right. Our second question is to get to know if anyone has been to Iceland before. And we'll give you a second to fill out that poll. It looks like a lot of people have never been. Got a few yeses in the group. Awesome. I think you're going to learn a lot about Iceland today. And then our final poll of the morning, in one word, what comes to mind when you think of Iceland? You can submit more than one response, so keep them counting. Aw, freedom, beauty, Eurovision. Love it. And clearly geothermal is very heavily represented from our energy-oriented group. But I think innovation, tourism are also really important, mining similarly. I love that focus on innovation and creativity that's on your minds today. So before we get started with our day, we'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and the organization you're coming from. If you have any difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, please chat event support for assistance and someone will come and help you. During the workshop, all attendees will be muted. Please submit any questions that you have in the chat and our moderators will collect them and curate those questions, and then they'll be asked in a panel discussion following the presentations. And like all previous workshops, the recording of this workshop will be available on the ASEC website at www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. So if you have to step away or you want to rewatch this or you want to share it with one of your colleagues or friends, you're able to do that. So we'll move into our first presentation today, Powering the Future. Lessons from Iceland's electric utility model for Alaska's rail belt grid. And welcome people putting their names in the chat. That's wonderful. So let's get started. During the presentation, again, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll pull them into the panel discussion later. And please join me in welcoming our first presenter of the workshop, Dr. Gwen Holdman. Gwen is the Chief Scientist at Alaska Center for Energy and Power. She's an applied energy research program, and we are an applied energy research program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We're focused on community scale, fossil, renewable, and alternative energy technologies. Gwen specializes in energy policy and planning, small scale nuclear systems, and geothermal energy. And yes, major kudos to her for all of her work there. Before joining UAF, Gwen worked as a design engineer and project manager, including leading the design and construction of Alaska's only operating geothermal power plant at Gina Hot Springs. So welcome, Gwen.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Iceland this morning. It's certainly one of my very favorite topics. Because I worked on geothermal so long in Alaska, and you can see when we did the little word cloud how important geothermal is really like considered pretty synonymous with Iceland. And so as a developer of this geothermal project in Alaska, I wound up starting to spend some time over in Iceland. Having spent some time in Iceland, I recognized that it wasn't just this potential for developing geothermal resources that created some potential synergies between Alaska and Iceland, but also all of these different other ways in which there's real similarities between our populations, these small, northern places that often kind of swing above their weight. And so one of these ways is really around not just how they're using geothermal resources, but more from a broader sort of standpoint, the way that they're managing their energy systems in Alaska that made me recognize there's a lot of opportunity to learn some lessons from Iceland and share those with my fellow Alaskans. So this is just a quick comparison. I realize a lot of you are already familiar with Iceland, but just a quick comparison between Iceland and Alaska. Iceland's got about half as many residents as Alaska does. I often think it's pretty amazing what Iceland is able to accomplish with really not that much more than the population of the larger Anchorage metropolitan area in a lot of ways. It's quite a lot smaller from a geographic standpoint. The per capita income is pretty similar. We both rank very high on the Human Development Index. Iceland grows quite a lot more food domestically than we do in the U.S. About 50% of the food that's consumed in Iceland is grown there. And their electricity and heat is supplied pretty close to 100% with renewable energy resources. We think a lot of geothermal when it comes to Iceland. And I was actually a little surprised to see that hydropower didn't show up on the word cloud at all. About 80% of Iceland's electric power is actually produced from hydroelectric resources. However, they heat almost 95%, I think, of the country is heated with geothermal resources. And then I went ahead and I put in the little three-legged stool. Most of Alaskans have kind of seen this for the state of Alaska with the oil industry, government spending, and then all of the other sectors like mining, tourism, fisheries, kind of counted in that third other three-legged stool. And then for Iceland, if you sort of did a similar kind of thing there, it would really be around tourism, which is a much more significant portion of their economy, heavy industry, and then fisheries and food production. I think agriculture represents about 3.8% of their GDP, so that's a more significant proportion of their economy. What I really want to spend time today focusing on, though, is the similarities between Iceland's ring grid, the electric grid that all Icelanders are connected to. And unlike Alaska, where we've got a more fragmented electric grid system, Iceland actually has a single unified grid network that all communities are connected to, with the exception of one, Grimsey Island, which actually makes Iceland an Arctic nation. That's a small island off the northern coast that actually the Arctic Circle cuts across that island, and that is actually operating off a diesel microgrid, just like many of our rural communities in Alaska do. So narrowing in on the rail belt grid, the geographic differences between Alaska and Iceland go away a little bit. When you look at the distance that's covered by Iceland's ring grid and the rail belt grid, they're not really that different. The distance between Reykjavik and Akureyri, which I think of as like the Anchorage and the Fairbanks of Iceland, it's about 250 miles to drive between those two towns. And so again, it's not actually spatially that different when we're just narrowing in on the rail belt region. You can see that there's not that dissimilar of installed capacity in terms of generation. What you do see where there's a pretty significant difference, and I'll definitely be diving into this a little bit more, is that the annual sales of electric power on Iceland's ring grid is quite a lot higher than in Iceland, and the per capita sales is even higher than that. It's about 6 times more than what the per capita sales is on the rail belt grid, and that has some really significant repercussions, both from an industry standpoint, but also from a cost standpoint. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So this presentation really draws from a white paper that Erlinger Gudleifsen, who you'll be hearing from later today, and I worked on. And so Ellie is one of our colleagues at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, who's actually based over in Iceland. And the two of us worked together to develop this white paper, Insights into the Icelandic Energy Market, really looking at ownership and asset management strategies for an islanded grid. And that's really why I think there are these tremendous similarities between Alaska and Iceland compared to other places in the United States or other places in Europe for that matter, because we've both got these isolated grids that are not connected, in our case, to Canada or the lower 48, or in the case of Iceland, they're not connected to Europe physically through a transmission cable either. And so that means that the power that's produced has to be consumed locally. And that also creates some challenges just for how we're going to manage these assets and how we are going to manage or develop and manage the grid upon which these assets, what they're connected to. So we developed this white paper back in 2023, and we invited a group of Alaskans to go on a policy tour to Iceland to learn a little bit more about how Iceland manages their energy policy, their assets, and basically, what lessons we might be able to learn. And the big highlights from the white paper is that the cost of energy in Iceland is quite a bit less than it is in Alaska. I'll talk a little bit more about that, with the exception. I don't know where our friend from Juneau there, Robert, went to, but for most of Alaska, our cost of energy is pretty high. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then really what policy decisions facilitated sort of this very robust energy market in Alaska. So we were able to bring several legislators that are in key positions, many on the Energy Committee or the Resource Committee in the Senate, along with the Rail Belt CEOs, and had a chance for group learning opportunity around what's happening in Iceland and what we could learn from there. So just really quickly, this is a quick map of the country just to orient ourselves. People don't really live in the middle of Iceland. It's a pretty harsh climate. There's glaciers up there. It's the highlands. Might come across a lot of sheep there, but there's not so many. There's not so many people or settlements in that area. So most folks live, I think, within 50 miles of the coast, the vast majority. And so their grid is set up as a ring. And these are not, these triangles are not towns. These are generation stations. But a lot of them are sort of indicative of where the population centers would also be. And one big difference between their grid system, which is what we're seeing here, and the one on the rail belt, is that we've got a linear system, and that creates some inherent vulnerabilities because we've got this big, line and just a single, single linear direction that power is flowing from north to south with like multiple different, 3 major load balancing areas on that grid. Whereas in Iceland, they have a ring grid. It's literally called that. And so that means that power can be sent in 2 different directions. And that creates inherent benefits in terms of resilience on their grid. So I want to point that out. So when you look at the per capita annual generation, excluding the C&I industry, so the big industrial customers in Iceland. So this is basically just the residential consumption along with small businesses and just sort of the general economic activity. Alaska and Iceland are pretty similar once you reduce the population differences and exclude the C&I industry component of the load. Once you add that in, though, you can see pretty quickly that Iceland consumes quite a bit more electric power than we do on the rail belt. This is about 5 times more when you add in the differences in terms of per capita. You can see it's basically 6 times more. I added in the population difference again here. And this is actually this has always been really interesting to me. I think that it's recognized in Iceland that they produce and sell a lot more power than most places do, but we don't necessarily think about what the implications are, the benefits of that might be for the general population. And so that's really what that white paper that Ellie and I worked on was really intended to sort of highlight. And this is really, when you kind of look historically at the annual production, again, on the rail belt grid, this is mostly the rail belt grid, and Iceland, you can really see that historically, these trended pretty closely to one another. And it was really in this like mid-1990s where there's this pretty significant bifurcation between what's happening in Iceland and what's happening in Alaska, which has sort of stayed on the same trajectory. And so that's kind of what I think is interesting to sort of look at and think a little bit about. And it does also impact quite a bit our delivered cost of energy. And the reason is because they're selling more kilowatt hours. They're able to basically spread those fixed costs across more kilowatt hour sales. And that brings the cost down for everybody, not just those heavy industrial users, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. I do want to just kind of highlight the costs here in Alaska for electric power and compare those to Iceland. So this is a chart here that shows the varying costs in different markets in Alaska. We start down there with Juneau that has benefited from really inexpensive hydroelectric power for a long time. The US average is that purple line that's right up above that right here. Not sure if you can see my pointer or not. Then you've got, basically Tugach, the Matsu area that's in this kind of the MEA and Tugach Electric Association that are this light blue line. Fairbanks is quite a bit higher than that. You've got the average for PCE communities as a whole. And then way up here are PCE communities that are, the orange line is really all PCE communities. And then the line above that is PCE communities that are less than 1,000 in population. So you can really see how there's like significant disparities in the cost of electricity. I'm going to focus on these rail belt costs. So this is really between this 20 cents and 30 cents number here. And I'm going to compare that to Iceland. So I used these 2021 numbers. I wasn't able to update them, but I think that the point is still fairly valid, even if these like specific numbers have changed. The commercial rates in Iceland are around 7 cents a kilowatt hour. For Golden Valley on the rail belt, maybe closer to 20 cents. And then for residential consumers, it's 11 cents versus about 26 cents. And sometimes Golden Valley has been getting a little bit higher than that. And so it's really significant differences, despite the fact that we're both small markets. And a lot of that is both because they're highly reliant on renewables, both hydro and geothermal that don't really have a fuel cost component associated with them. And secondly, that they're just selling so much more power. And so those fixed costs, again, are spread across more kilowatt hour sales. And that naturally drives down the cost of power for everybody involved. I want to mention that the place that Iceland is today isn't where Iceland was back in the 1970s. Iceland was at that time one of the poorest countries in Europe. They did not have a interconnected electric grid. This is kind of an old map of small parts of the Iceland grid. The history of the build out of the ring grid in Iceland is actually really, really similar to what we have seen in Alaska on the rail belt. And this is something that I found also to be quite interesting in terms of similarities. There's basically these 4 different, greater municipal areas that had regional grids in Iceland. So in the Reykjavik area in the southwest, in the north around Akureyri, Ísafjörður in the west fjords, and then over here in Egilsstaðir in the east. And so these were all kind of autonomously operating grids. They used a high portion of imported diesel fuel, about 50% diesel, and then local hydroelectric where that was available for those specific regional grids, basically. And these were municipally managed and owned, these assets and these grids were. And that reminds me a lot, or it's very similar to our cooperative structure on the rail belt in Alaska, where we have four cooperatives that share that grid, and then you've got the city of Stewart as well. So over time, the ring grid was built out. So this took about 12 years. It was a pretty massive investment by the government of Iceland to go ahead and connect those independent regions. But at that time, everything was still owned by the municipalities, by local ownership, whoever owned the local generating stations, independent power producers, or municipalities. And what the government primarily owned at that time was these interconnecting sections of the grid. And so within the municipal territory, they owned the grid, the transmission grid in those areas, along with the distribution grids. They were kind of vertically integrated utilities, just like our cooperatives are today. And the government owned these interconnected transmission bits. And this is not too dissimilar to what we have in Alaska today from a transmission ownership. And Curtis is going to talk a little bit more about Alaska Energy Authority's role in terms of asset ownership in Alaska. And then at the same time, they started to build out some larger generation stations where they could really realize some economies of scale. And those were mostly hydroelectric facilities. So here's an example of the largest one that has been built, the Karenhooker Dam. This was under construction in that 2008, and this was essentially built with the goal of selling all of the power, or almost all of the power produced from here, to a single aluminum smelter. And so, so this was a state-built asset, but the power, at least initially, was entirely intended to be sold to this single customer, the single CNI customer, who participated in a long-term power purchase contract. And we'll hear more about that from Ellie later on in this workshop. And so here is the aluminum smelting industry, and the way I think Iceland would think about aluminum smelting is that it's a way for them to export their energy in ways other than through undersea cables or through pipelines. So this is an extremely energy intensive industry. And so they're using their native hydroelectric and geothermal resources to produce cheap power at scale, and then export energy in the form of aluminum products. So like this. And this is actually something that Iceland has dabbled in for a really long time. The hydroelectric facility that you can see there on the right is the first one that was built back in the 1960s to serve the first aluminum smelter that was built in Iceland. So when you look at energy production by sector in Iceland, you can see that about 75% of the power that's produced in Iceland is consumed by this heavy industry sector, and only about a quarter is produced or is consumed by the public sector. During that policy tour, we went and visited a lot of different sites, but one of the ones that was probably most important to the group from Alaska was Landsnet, visiting the transmission operator for Iceland, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But we also understood how having access to relatively cheap energy creates all these cascading benefits for Icelanders. And that includes this, heavy amount of agricultural activity that's happening. A lot of that is through greenhouses, which are heated with geothermal energy and benefit from relatively inexpensive electric power also. We'll hear a little bit more about some of the innovation later on in this workshop that Iceland has been engaged in. And then, of course, we visited some of these generation facilities as well. we went to the Hetlish-Haiti geothermal power plant and the geothermal resource park, and also visited a small independent power producer. Independent power producers are still a pretty important part, if a small component, but there's a number of different independent power producers in Iceland. And so we really wanted to have the opportunity to hear from their perspective as well. So Iceland really differs. I described sort of before about how the generation of these assets is a combination of state ownership, local independent power producers, and then municipally owned. The grid itself, however, has now been transferred entirely to state ownership through the National Electric or Transmission Corporation, which is called Landsnet. And this was really driven by EU regulations around the unbundling and basically of the electric market in Europe. And because Iceland is not part of the European Union, but they participate in the European Economic Zone. And so that means that they're required to take on some of the mandates from the EU. And one of them was really this unbundling of generation, transmission, and distribution assets, enabling competition among generation, but then maintaining monopoly among transmission and distribution assets. And so the distribution assets are owned by the municipal utilities in Iceland, and then the transmission assets have been transferred over time slowly to all now belong to Landsnet, so the state transmission corporation. And then at the same time, there was this change around deregulating of electricity production and sales, and so that means that it's a totally deregulated market at this point in time. So Icelanders have the opportunity to purchase electric power from whatever provider that they want to. I'll show kind of a picture of that slide, of the system here in a minute. So just kind of going back to showing the grid and all the generation stations again, you can look at asset ownership in two ways in Iceland. One is by the individual number of projects, so individual generation stations, whether it's hydroelectric or whether that's maybe geothermal. And in the hydropower industry, about 96% of production is from state-owned assets, but there's actually a number of smaller independent power producers and municipally owned projects as well. So when you look by individual projects, municipalities, so kind of I think of a little bit like our cooperatives, are about 58% by individual projects of the assets, and independent power producers are about 5%. When you actually look from the perspective of annual generation, you can see those much larger assets that are owned by the state kind of wash out the other ones. And so the state actually produces 75% of the electric power from their generation assets compared to municipalities and independent power producers. And so this asset ownership for the transmission and this over time, this transition from a more diverse ownership for the different transmission assets to 100% state-owned occurred over time. And a lot of that was because the individual assets that the municipal utilities owned were maybe tied up with other sorts of assets, and so disentangling them in terms of like debt and other kinds of issues like that took time to really to manage. And so today they've have transferred all of that over to Landsnet. And so that's the biggest difference right now between Alaska's energy sector and Iceland's, or one of the two big ones. And so when you look at the electricity sector here in Iceland, you've got these different generators that includes both the state utility. So this is Landsvirkjun. So this would be sort of similar to the Alaska Energy Authority owning Bradley Lake, for example. And then you've got these other municipal utilities here on the generation side. Transmission is entirely monopoly owned and managed by a state-owned corporation, Landsnet. And then you've got the distribution utilities who then distribute the power, who you're actually purchasing power from. And then, or actually that are owning the distribution lines. And then you're actually purchasing power at the retail level. And so that's a pretty competitive market within Iceland itself. This is an example in terms of consumer energy price structure. And this, just to be clear, we've got both kroners and cents in here. This is just for the energy cost. So this doesn't include either taxes or the cost for transmission and distribution. So it's lower than the slide that I showed before for that reason. But essentially, Icelanders can go online and pick what vendor they want to purchase their electricity from. Some of these, I think they're the ones in green, actually have generation, and some of the other ones are just aggregators and resellers of electric power. And so just from a really high level, I just want to make sure I'm not going over my time here. Some of the policies that we really observed about Iceland is really both this commitment to energy independence. So they're very interested in moving away from imported diesel fuel. That was very important to them. And also just from a perspective of heating, a lot of Iceland depended also on imported fuel, mostly coal from Europe for heating. And so they had a very strong commitment, especially after the energy the energy issues in the 1970s, to move toward energy independence. Because they don't have any domestic fossil fuels there, that meant leaning into their renewable energy resources. And so one of the reasons why we think of geothermal and Iceland so synonymously is because they really are the country that more than any other started to look at developing geothermal resources for all of these beneficial and sort of cascading applications, not just the potential for space heating, power generation, but also all of these other value-added processes and products that we'll hear more about throughout this workshop. And then industry partnerships to build up infrastructure. This is a really big one. We'll hear a little bit more from Ellie about this later. This, to me, is really the chicken and egg problem that Iceland sort of navigated pretty deftly, which is that we want to attract additional industry. We want to see, new businesses that might create new jobs. But in order to get there, we need affordable energy sources and kind of long-term understanding of what the price to generate or purchase that electricity is going to be. And so Iceland was able to manage these, this sort of navigate this area of like, how do we build up infrastructure in order to bring in heavy industry without taking undue risk on the local domestic population. Investment in transmission is something that you would hear from the Iceland energy sector has been extremely key. Without investment in transmission at the state level, they would not be able to move that power from the places where they have the potential to build large-scale generation assets like that Karinhukar Dam that I showed in one of the earlier pictures, to places where that electric power is actually needed. And so that investment in transmission has been really important. Having a unified transmission system that's state-owned means that they can make strategic investments in that transmission and ultimately support the development of new generation assets wherever those assets are located. Iceland's done a really good job of sort of managing a long-term energy plan in terms of selecting new projects that would be worth developing. And there is a lot of, sometimes a lot of controversy about what those projects would be. Like even that Karinhukar Dam that I showed the picture of, that really large hydro asset that's state-owned in Iceland. It was a pretty split decision from the population and from their parliament as to whether to move forward with that project. It was nearly 50-50. But today, I think that most Icelanders would say that was actually a very good investment in terms of not only how it influenced the energy markets in Iceland, but also has really supported Iceland's economy in a really stable way over time. And then as part of all of this, they've done a very good job, and again, we'll hear about this more later, of investing in a knowledge economy. They've built up a lot of the different knowledge sector that they need to manage both their individual assets, and that's been a really major strength of theirs as well over time. And that's all I've got. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close out my slide. This is actually a picture at the Carb Fix sites. This is at one of the geothermal parks at Headless Shady. And I think there's a few people that are going to be on our first panel that are in this picture. So I thought I would end with that. So let me stop my share. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Curtis. I saw Curtis join here. And I know, Curtis, you have had a chance to visit Iceland. We had a chance to go there together. We did go ahead and visit and meet with Lensnet and Lensverken, visit one of these aluminum smelters. That was a really great opportunity. I really appreciate the time that you took to come over and do that. And so with that being said, I'd like to turn it over to you to hear a little bit about how we've sort of taken some of these lessons. The legislature put some effort into embedding some of these concepts into legislation that was passed last year and that you have been carrying forward at the state level. And so thank you, Curtis. I think I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to admit, it was my first trip to Iceland, and it was shockingly surprising how similar it was to Alaska. And it was also just as surprising how far we are behind in what we've seen Iceland do and where we could have been or should be heading. It was very eye-opening, and with that, I think it's given us a lot of a path forward. And part of this path forward is the Railbelt Transmission Organization. But first, I want to talk about AEA because AEA is kind of a unique animal. We're a state corporation. We're owned by the state of Alaska. We have our own independent board of directors, and we split up what we do through various programs. We have Railbelt Energy owned assets. So AEA does own Bradley Lake Hydro Facility, the largest in the state. We also own the Alaska Intertie, which is 170 miles of intertie between Willow and Healy. And we also own Sterling to Quartz Creek, which is down on the Kenai Peninsula, about a 40-mile segment. And then we're currently in the process of building a $400 million high voltage direct current transmission line off the Kenai Peninsula over to Beluga, or basically a second route off of the Kenai Peninsula. And so a lot to what Landsnet does, we have a third of all the transmission lines within AEA. We also run a power cost equalization program for rural Alaska. It affects 192 communities. It's a $48 million program. But we look at the cost of Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau, the state capital, and looking at that, and the Regulatory Commission of Alaska sets a rate, usually about 20 cents. And so that's the floor, and then it pays as high as 75 cents in rural Alaska. But it's important to note is if the price of energy goes down on the rail belt, there's more money available in the formula for rural Alaska. So if the prices rise in the Cook Inlet area, then there's less money in rural Alaska, and it's just tied to a statutory formula. But it just kind of goes to show you that this just the railroad alone will have great effects across the state. We also have rural energy, bulk fuel upgrades, rural power system upgrades, circuit rider for training. We have a team of people that go out to rural Alaska to train. And also, they also provide for electrical emergency assistance. And we also have the renewable energy and energy efficiency. We have a whole team with whether it be biomass or hydro or solar, also running federal programs, high efficiency grant and rebate program. And then we have our own grants and loans where we have the Renewable Energy Fund, which is really unique in the sense that we have an application process, and we go out and look for projects that are marginal. We look for projects that need that feasibility in conceptual stage to see if it's a real project. And in the 15-year history of that program, we've already identified well over 100 projects. We have 60 in development, and that has actually saved in rural Alaska primarily 100 million gallons of diesel fuel. So it's a big change for us to change that landscape in rural Alaska. We also have a power project fund to help kind of provide patient capital for projects. And then we do a lot of energy planning, whether it be the governor's energy security task force, electronic library. We have a lot of our information now forward facing, over 14,000 documents. AEA has spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's only right that that information be forward facing for people to look at it and hopefully draw from it and develop energy projects from it based on that information. And then we also have another federal program, the 401D for grid resilience that project's working on. And then we got new added duties with the Rail Belt Transmission Organization, or as we commonly call the RTO. A little bit about the rail belt. As you have the ring around Iceland, we have what we call the rail belt. There's kind of a busy slide. I do apologize for that, but basically, if you look at the bottom of the slide under number 1, where it says Dixon Diversion, that's actually the Bradley Lake Hydro Project. We're actually looking at a diversion project to increase the water into Bradley by 50%, hence the Dixon Diversion. But that's where the transmission lines really start in Alaska. And where Iceland has, over the last 20 years, pulled everything into one organization, we still have multiple owners. And that's how the RTO got created, to try to help handle that. Because when the power leaves Dixon or leaves Bradley Lake, those transmission lines are owned by AEA. And then we connect up near Homer and on the red area. And Homer Electric owns those transmission lines right up to the Sterling Soldotna area, and then it goes back to AEA ownership for 40 miles. And by Quartz Creek, then we connect into Chugach Electric, and Chugach Electric owns into Anchorage and a little bit into Eagle River. And when it gets to Eagle River, then you swap to Matanuska Electric Association, and then that's about 42 miles, and then you swap back to AEA for 170 miles before we finally land up near Healy, and then that's owned by Golden Valley. One of the things that we've been looking at, and this is on this map, kind of by 8, it says grip match, but the number 8 there, that's that transmission line across Cook Inlet that I mentioned earlier, that $400 million project. We already have funding for $270 million of the little over $400 million project. We're short about $143 million. And then the other item that we're looking at is taking from Beluga all the way up to Healy, a second line to Fairbanks. If we were FERC regulated in the like the lower 48 is, we would already be required to have 2 transmission lines. We only have 1. It's been described as an extension cord, which sometimes it feels that way. We are susceptible to downtime. If we had something take down one of the lines between Anchorage and Fairbanks, we had a fire actually down in the Kenai Peninsula that we were unable to move Bradley Power for 4 months. So this is what we've operated for 50 plus years. And it's just a way that we can't continue to operate. We need to have redundancy, and we need to kind of work as one with all the utilities. And with that, House Bill 307, which is kind of integrated transmission systems, it did several things. I would probably say this is one of the most important pieces of legislation for the rail belt since statehood. The bill incentivized new energy development by extending statutes to independent power producers. It also changed how AEA operates. We had a board of directors we shared with another state entity. The board was a good board, but it didn't have the expertise in energy that we needed. And with that, we now have a new board of 8 individuals, 2 commissioners, 6 public members. But the seats were designated in the fact that we would have somebody who represented the rail belt, somebody who would represent rural Alaska, somebody who was in engineering, one that had financed energy projects. And so now we have a very diverse board that actually are from members across the state. And we're currently chaired by, as many of you know, Clay Copland, who is the CEO of Cordova Electric. He serves as our board of directors. He serves as the chairman. We also have our own employees. This is more of a nuance. We had our employees. We just happened to lease them from another state agency, but now we have direct hire of our employees. But more importantly, it created this Railbelt Transmission Organization. And when I say we created this Railbelt transmission organization, and it was to establish and administer a non-discriminatory open access tariff. It was to try to recover all the cost from Bradley all the way to Fairbanks. And then it replaces the wholesale charges assessed by each utility. So we had operating as a backbone transmission system. The bill also reduced interest rates for power project loan funds to help encourage lower costs to develop projects along the route. And then also with the 307, the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. It was really important that the RCA, a lot of duties are assigned to this regulatory agency, but it hadn't been updated in a long time. And so, similar to what we did with our board of directors, it not only changed salaries, our board of directors work pro bono, but the RCA has five paid commissioners. It updated their salaries and their qualifications. Again, going back to needing an engineer, an attorney, a CPA to help govern the regulatory commission. It broadens their criteria for determining just and reasonable rates. So it kind of broadened and gave them more authority. And it increases the regulatory cost charges for utilities, for telecoms and pipeline carriers, so they could recover some of those expenses. And it requires the RCA approval of wholesale power contracts between utility and independent power producers, and more transparency in state and local exemptions. It also has the Electric Reliability Organization impacts. The ERO was in existence, but it aligns the Railbelt Reliabilities Council with the RTO duties by removing some open access transmission and transmission system recovery, exempts utilities from certain size projects, and mandates the EROs to prioritize reliability, stability, and customer cost. You would think that would just naturally happen, but now we actually have it in legislation. The current state of the rail belt, and this is where we've been. It's not where we're going. But the rail belt has been limited with the interregional transfer capacity. And again, as I mentioned, we lack redundant transmission lines, and the ownership and operations are split, again, among 6 different entities. The focus on local planning and management is a transmission wheeling rates for electric movement. One thing that we really wanted to push was ending the pancaking of rates, depending on the number of areas that energy was transmitted. Bradley Lake, even though it's in Homer, 17% of the water or 17% of the power goes to Golden Valley Electric. And so across the state, when you look at it, if you were getting water or you're getting power from getting it from Bradley, and then you cross Homer Electric's lines and Chugach's lines and AEA lines and MEA and everything. When you look at it, you're just getting all these rates piled on. And one of that is to try to have this postage stamp one rate, which is, again, looking back at the Iceland model of how to do that. And barriers to construction of transmission lines and new generation projects. That's also one that we've been encountering. And then there's barriers to economic dispatch. And so when 307 was passed, and I really have to hand it off to Gwen. She worked very hard on that bill. There's a lot of pieces and parts to this bill that was moving in a very short time last year, and she was really key to getting it to this point. And also, the governor had a energy task force. And one of the recommendations was the elimination of pancaping and wheeling rates and charging and the establishment of the RTO. So there was been a group of us working on this, and then through the task force and then actually through the legislation, I think there was yeoman's work done literally in a period of about 6 to 12 months. And the governor signed the bill just in July of this last year. The purpose of the RTO, again, was created by the legislature to establish what we call the open access tariff, or commonly known as the OAT. And the OAT will recover the cost, wholesale charges assessed by each utility with fair and equitable mechanisms, and also the backbone operating systems. Now, I will stop at this point and just kind of mention that one of the things that we have to do as the OAT or as the RTO is we have to determine what is the backbone. We can't just assume that it's every transmission line between Fairbanks and Bradley Lake. So that's an ongoing discussion. There's a lot of things that we have to work out when we've been doing something for 50 years, one particular way. It's taking a lot of open minds and kind of looking at what is the goal for the whole state, for the whole rail belt, as opposed to what's good for a Pacific utility or section of the state. We also want to align with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission (FERC) standards to kind of remove barriers of competition in the Alaska wholesale power market. The structure of the RTO is we have a governance committee with representatives from AEA and each of the railbelt utilities, and the RRC is an ex officio member, and the committee manages and operates the RTO. The fairest way that we split this up is we all have different ownership interest on the rail belt. I would probably say that AEA has the largest ownership and most likely one, and it definitely will when we have the HVDC line completed, followed by Chugach Electric. But one thing that we wanted to do is treat everybody equally. So everybody that's on the governance committee with a voting member has 16.67% interest as far as paying the bills, as well as voting on issues. And so you don't have one utility or one agency kind of dominate it. We have elected officers. Anybody could serve as chair, vice chair, or secretary that are on the voting committee. We elected chair as Matanuska Electric. The vice chair is Golden Valley Electric, and AEA is filling in the role of secretary treasurer. And the RTO is subject to the RCA under Alaska statute, and it operates as a division of AEA for administrative purposes. And quite frankly, we still are struggling with the idea of what is administrative purposes among the five utilities and AEA, just to make sure we kind of know what lane we're in. The current status and development of the RTO, and that is we established through public meetings and bylaws. Since the signing of HB 307, the RTO held 8 public meetings, established a charter, adopted bylaws based on the Bradley Lake Management Committee. Bradley Lake is managed by a management committee of the 5 utilities and AEA. And so we had a good model, and 307 said follow that model, and that's what we did. During this phase, AEA chaired the RTO. And once application was submitted to the Regulatory Commission of Alaska for a certificate of public convenience and necessity, we submitted that ahead of schedule on December 20th, and we expect to have a final decision on that application in June 18th, 2025. And then when we started the new process of actually developing the OAT, we had an election of officers so we could carry us through a full calendar year. And with that, the RTO is developing an open access transmission tariff that meets 307. And again, when you're looking at a piece of legislation like 307, it doesn't tell you everything you do line by line. And so it's been a long conversation with utilities as we've have working groups and technical groups to, again, put this transmission tariff together, and we were required by the statute to do it by July 1st of 2025. So we had less than 6 months to actually stand up the RTO and submit that to the RCA, and at the same time, we need to develop an OAT and submit that by July 1st, 2025. And I will just say that the RTO, the governing committee, the CEOs, the utilities, myself, we're all committed to meeting that July 1st deadline, and we are meeting. As far as the RTO is concerned, we actually have a meeting this Friday for 4 hours, and it's going to be one of many on many Fridays going forward until we meet that July 1st deadline. A lot of issues to work through. Don't know if we'll get it all right the first time, but definitely we have something to work from. And as Gwen mentioned, taking the CEOs to Iceland, and then I had the opportunity to go to Iceland. That I think is the model in the back of our head of how to try to do this. It's not going to be just like Iceland, obviously. The legislation gives us a little bit more autonomy, I think, than Iceland has, but it's a step in the right direction as far as developing and having this one access transmission. And with that, I just want to thank everybody, and I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Curtis. That was fascinating and really wonderful to hear how the governance process is evolving over time. I appreciate that deep dive very much. I know we're supposed to go into a panel discussion where we can fold questions into, but I'm quickly checking the chat to see if there's anything there. Looks like people are holding them for the panel. So if you're okay, we'll move right into that. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Gwen and Curtis, for those in-depth talks on the development of Iceland and Alaska's grid infrastructures. Coming up, our panel discussion will go deeper into energy infrastructure, ownership and governance models, the costs, the accessibility, and I think most importantly, the desired improvements that meet the future needs of Alaska. Gwen and Curtis started discussing this, and I love that comment from Curtis. This is where we have been. It's not where we're going, and I would love to bring that into the panel discussion, if I may pose that to you all. During the panel discussion, please continue to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get everyone's questions folded into the discussion. Please help me welcome Travis Millian, Andrew Jensen, and Erlinger Goodlifson to join Gwen and Curtis in this panel discussion. The session will be moderated by Jeremy Casper from Alaska Center for Energy and Power. He's our director. Jeremy, I will leave it to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So it's great to be here on this panel. So as Vanessa mentioned, I am the director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks with my esteemed colleagues. And I'm just going to kick this off by, I'm going to go roundtable in the order of the that we have folks on the agenda, and give people an opportunity to introduce themselves, keeping in mind that not everybody was able to hear those two intro talks. So just a few minutes would be fantastic, reflecting on your thoughts on House Bill 307, now that we have the RTO, and maybe discuss some new directions that we could take or things that we didn't do. With that, I will hand it off to Gwen Holdman, who is the chief scientist with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. And I will, if you guys could introduce yourselves, I think that would be the easiest way to handle this panel. And then we'll go to Gwen, Andrew, Travis, Curtis, and Ellie. And I will say before we jump in, I am wearing my Iceland sweater in honor of this panel. So thank you. Gwen?
Me too. Me too. It's Iceland Day, right? So, no, I just very quickly again, because some folks might have joined us late. I've spent a lot of time working in Iceland from Alaska. I think people have gotten very tired over the years of hearing me brag up Iceland, and I'm glad to have other folks that are starting to kind of really see what some of the similarities are. I really appreciate your comments, Curtis. And so with that being said, I'm just happy to participate on this panel. I'm going to turn it over. Did you say Andrew's next? All right.
All right. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Jeremy. So Andrew Jensen, I work in governor's office, food security policy and energy security policy. So I had the privilege of carrying this legislation last year, which is a very unusual thing for someone within this role in the governor's office to do. Ended up spending, I think, the last 11 straight days of the session in Juneau, which was not planned. So I'm wearing the jacket I wore most of that time in honor of that period, I guess. But it was, yes, being thrust into the role of working on rail belt, power, politics, was certainly an eye-opening experience, but also, getting it over the finish line, I think, as Curtis had mentioned, I think is a major step for the rail belt that is long overdue. It's a major step, but it's only a step. It's going to take, a period of years, I think, to fully flesh this out. And this is something that we knew going into it. Just the process of, this passed, it was signed a year ago, or July to July 1st. That's a year. Adjudicating the tariff at the RCA can take up to 430-ish days. Travis probably knows that statutory term. All these utilities have transmission revenue that's wound into their base rates that's going to have to be unwound. I know Golden Valley may do a rate case this year. So I mean, there's a lot of steps that are going to have to be taken to fully unwind this, and that's just the nature of the regulatory process. But we've gotten the process started now in a way that it hasn't been done before, where the utilities are all at the table. They did have to be, forced, mandated to the table. But I think I've been really appreciative of the way they've bared down, rolled up their sleeves. I know that the staff at every utility and at AEA has been working extremely hard on this, on the technical side of things, but also on the regulatory side, getting through the RCA process. One thing that gave me some optimism early on was the RCA opened a docket. So what's the form of this certificate going to look like? And that docket was opened and closed in 2 months. And it involved every railbelt utility, which I think is probably unprecedented in the history of railbelt, anything that the utilities all were on the same page, got a docket opened and closed in 2 months at the RCA. So I think that's been a positive sign. As Curtis mentioned, they filed their CPCN early. The motivation of the holidays probably had something to do with that as well. But there's been other progress, I think, that's happened recently. Matanuska Electric and Chugach finally executed and began operating as a single load balancing area a couple of weeks ago. That is another major milestone that's been in the works for a long time, that was also a result of a mandate that also took several years to pull off, but I think is a huge positive. And when people talk about economic dispatch, we now have, I think, more than half of the rail belt now is working in an economic dispatch situation. So once transmission lines are upgraded, we can really start to see that improve. So I think we are making progress. We're no longer just talking about these things. And I think that's the one thing that 307 was able to achieve, is that we are making concrete progress towards these things, that shared goals that everyone's agreed on. And so with that, I'm looking forward to the conversation today, and we'll turn it over to whoever was next there. Jeremy, I missed the order.
We'll hand it over to Travis. Thanks, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. Travis Moline, CEO of Golden Valley Electric. As Curtis showed in his presentation, we're the northernmost utility on the rail belt. Overall, I would say, just my thoughts after the visit in Iceland last year, 307 was a good push in the right direction to really kind of force the utilities into a unified transmission system, which has been probably needed for quite some time, but as we've seen with other things, sometimes kind of a push from the legislation is needed in order to get us all in the same sandbox and working together. And as Curtis touched on as well, I mean, we've been working through the process of getting everything filed in the timeline that is required in the legislation. We're, as he said, working on many meetings coming up here in the next few months to get the final part of the OAT filed by July 1st, which is going to be a huge undertaking because there's a lot of little nuances through this process to get this across the finish line. But overall, I mean, I would agree 307 is a good step in the right direction, especially after seeing the feedback from Iceland and how they were able to progress to the direction they're at today and where Alaska really needs to go going forward. And with that, I'll just kind of leave it at that. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot more discussions on other aspects of that and the trip to Iceland. So thank you.
Thanks, Travis. And I will hand it off to Curtis next.
As far as the 307 and the bill, that was really a team effort, Gwen, but, Andrew and the governor. A lot of credit has to be given for the governor to actually step up, introduce the bill, realizing the issue that, quite frankly, we have been unable to resolve for 50 years, and to make this first attempt to getting to this point where we're at. And I think that you can say all the utility executives, we're all engaged in this process. But we also realize that we're all family, and sometimes during this process, you don't know whether to laugh or cry when you look at your family. So it's something that we're working on. But I think with everybody that's done it, everybody that's still engaged in the process, we're getting there. It's good. Andrew's been attending our meetings at the RTO as we've helped craft to help give us a little bit of guidance in the sense of what was said or what was meant during the legislative process, because sometimes it's not always recorded as such, but at least we get some ideas of where we're at. And then we do have legislators who are very, very engaged in our progress. And so we are very incentivized to do this and do it right. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. And just a reminder, Curtis is the Executive Director of the Alaska Energy Authority. With that, I'll hand it off to Erlinger. And Erlinger, take it away, please.
Yes, dear folks. My name is Erlingur Gudlason. Most people call me Ellie. I'm researcher with Alaska Center for Energy and Power. I'm Icelander, based in Iceland, so most of the things that people have been talking about here is someone me to think, or my cause, or however we look at it. I remember the white paper that we wrote, me and Gwen, about the formation of the transmission grid in Iceland and the following up policy tour that we had. I remember how significant influence it had on the dialogue between the rail belt executives in Alaska. I remember, when we went out to the field, we met the transmission system operator and so on. And we came back to our facilities and sat down and say, okay, what can be done here to actually move the needle for Alaska? So I think that those first words were actually what ended up in a result of the 307 eventually. So I just stand here in Iceland and ask, what will be the next step for me on that way? What can I do? What other information or business connections or research contribution can I offer to actually keep on moving the needle for the state?
Thank you, Erlinger. With that, I will maybe put a question to the group, and I see we've got some questions in the chat. And one of the questions in the chat is a little bit more nuanced than my question, but I'm going to put the unnuanced out there as a conversation starter. One of the things that we did not do in our transmission bill that Iceland did do was that they basically nationalized their transmission system. Talk about that a little bit, and in particular, why that probably wouldn't be a great idea in Alaska, and what some of the issues are there. So with that, I'll maybe hand it out to the panel and see who wants to respond to that one first.
Well, I can jump in. I think that you have to take incremental steps that are achievable. And I think that jumping that far ahead to, single ownership, where I know that there's always been talk about a single system operator as well. But I think you have to get there in an orderly fashion. I think people do want to jump from zero to Iceland, and it's just not realistic to do that. I think the whole thing would have fallen apart if we had tried to take that step. You have, debt that's tied to assets. How do you manage that? I think that's a major factor in how do you take over or nationalize the system. I doubt there would have been as much appetite in the legislature for something like that as well, given some of the arguments we did hear against 307. So I would just weigh that in that I think there's an understanding of where we want to go, and that economic dispatch up and down the rail belt is an important goal to look at eventually having an independent system operator or a single operator, not necessarily even an independent, but an operator. Are goals that we know work elsewhere, but we have to kind of take an organized path forward versus just jumping to where we want to be versus what we have to do to get there.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for taking the leap of faith there and answering a tough question. And the debt issue, I think, is one that maybe needs a little bit of explaining. Travis, would you be comfortable working through that conversation a little bit about the debt and that single ownership versus the single ownership?
Yeah, and I would say, Jeremy, on that is, each utility, as we build out infrastructure, most of the time we're taking a percentage, if not a large percentage of loans out to build out that infrastructure, because as electric co-ops, we don't have a bunch of cash just sitting in the bank, burning a hole in our pocket. So we have to go and secure debt for that. So kind of as Andrew was alluding to, that if you had a single ownership of that, obviously the co-ops would need to be reimbursed for that debt if those assets were transferred over to another entity. So that's kind of what Andrew was hitting on. And I guess to piggyback on your question a little bit more is, whether it's a state government ran entity or a totally independent entity that would be a single operator, would still need to be determined. Looking at like the lower 48 in particular, and how, at least similar to Alaska, we're primarily cooperatives. In the lower 48, there's what they call GNTs, generation and transmission cooperatives, that serve just the generation and transmission. That's what they do, and sell that energy to the distribution co-op. So, we would have to evaluate whether a model like that would be more beneficial for the state of Alaska, as opposed to a government ran entity to run at least the transmission asset, or if it's generation and transmission. But there's a lot of different options out there for that, and lots of successful options that are out there as well.
And
Thanks,
Jeremy,
Travis.
I'm just going to chime in on this if you don't mind too, because I think one thing about Iceland that we do need to remember is that the utilities to some extent went into this kicking and screaming, some of them at least. And I think Ellie can kind of chime in on this. Like, this was not something that was necessarily a voluntary transition. It was something that was mandated. So it became a little bit more of like, okay, do we want to do this, to the conversation being, how do we go about this? Because they didn't really have a choice. They were given a bit of a mandate from the European Union. And I think that's one thing that's different for Alaska. Like Curtis mentioned, if we were in any jurisdiction in the lower 48, we wouldn't be able to get away with this like single umbilical cord, right? We'd have to have at least 2 transmission lines connecting our northern and southern regions. And so, similar, like in some ways, the fact that Alaska hasn't really had pressure from the outside, so it's like up to us to kind of figure things out. I'm not sure that you would wind up with the same outcome in Iceland had the utilities just been asked to kind of come up with a solution. I don't know, Ellie, if you want to chime in on that, but I think it's kind of important to note that it's like it was legislatively mandated.
Yeah, I can talk about that. There were, of course, it looks a little bit different, as Gwen is trying to explain. If this was not a choice, Iceland would have been fined. The state of Iceland would have been fined by the European Union if they would have not gone through with this. So they had to actually find a way with legislation, how to actually do it. They had 2 choices. It wasn't as they just ripped their assets off them overnight. They got to choose if they would sell their assets, just for cash, or if they would hand over their asset in exchange for equity in the transmission system operator, or if they would rent the assets. 2 municipalities actually decided to rent them, but they backed out from that pretty quickly. And majority of the assets that went into Landsnet were actually in exchange for equities here in Landsnet. So that, and the valuation, as Andrew mentioned, of course, there is maybe not all of the electrical co-ops that are ready to go this way, and that's what I haven't been understanding. But the valuation process was pretty simple. It was just asset valuation and depreciation, and was done with some economists and engineers and some sorts of people. So from an Icelandic perspective, it didn't feel like a really painful project. But today you can hear a little bit constraint between the former owner of majority of the assets, that's the National Energy Company, and the others, the transmission system operator. They're picking on each other a little bit sometimes, but I think that doesn't go very deep.
Thanks, Ellie. So I guess I'll shift to the a couple of questions in the chat there. So we've got the first question we've got is how can Alaska follow Iceland's example and achieve the economic efficiencies related to single ownership of energy infrastructure when our own grid is owned by so many partners? And the follow-on question there is, should the focus be on improving economic efficiencies and lowering prices through a simulation or adding additional redundancy by inviting new partners' investment? And again, it gets to the question of we're a very decentralized grid with decentralized planning. And so what are some of the things we might be able to do to overcome that without, we don't have the policy incentives or the push from the EU that Iceland did. So I'll open that up to the floor. And then I guess the follow-on question is, did HB 307 take us far enough down the line to get that process started, or should we be thinking about further legislation?
I can at least jump in here a little bit with, what is needed regarding what has helped the Icelandic system quite a lot, I think, over the years is long-term planning. And it goes into IPPs as well and so on. So long-term planning would be at least one of the key elements, I would say.
Following up on that, would any of the panelists want to comment on the planning efforts that were built into HB 307? I know there was a lot of back and forth on that and during the legislative process, but where did we actually land?
There was a lot of back and forth on that in terms of, we have an entity, the Electric Reliability Organization, which is named the Railbelt Reliability Council. And there was some initial early versions of 307 that would have transferred transmission planning as well to the RTO. I was a little bit baffled by the amount of pushback that what I thought was a fairly common sense thing would that if you're going to manage the transmission system, you should also be planning the transmission system, especially when you're looking at expense and projects, et cetera. That ended up being somewhat politically toxic. And so we ended up moving away from that in the actual legislation, and the transmission planning does remain at this point with the RRC. But as Curtis's slide pointed out, and I think there was a comment made that I think Gwen referenced in a letter that was public, that we know what's necessary to build out within the rail belt transmission system. This isn't like, we know the lines that need to be upgraded. We knew that, lines that need to be redundant, like a second northern intertie, the grip, the subsea line. I mean, we can sketch it out in a fairly short period of time in terms of what the infrastructure improvements that are necessary. I mean, and I think to the question about, what should we focus on in terms of planning? I mean, we've had data center people who have come to Alaska and they're looking around and seeing where, and they'll rule out huge parts of the rail belt immediately because there's only one transmission line coming into that area. And so I think if we want to attract industry, large load that would help disperse fixed costs, that would help reduce rates for everyone, you have to build the infrastructure. And so I think that one thing that 307 at least does, even though it didn't get into officially putting the planning in, it does have what can be a cost recovery mechanism. When you have an on-bill per kilowatt charge, that is a way to recover costs to build transmission projects. And I'd be curious since you guys are in those discussions, Travis and Curtis, and how this would work, if that is a realistic way where we look at how are you going to pay for some of these things, regardless of how they're planned, when we know things are needed.
On that note, I think it's important, if we look back where we were 5 years ago on the rail belt to where we are today, we have really we have jumped tall buildings to get to where we're at. And what I mean by that is if you look at just the rail belt, as far as Chugach Electric is upgrading from Anchorage down to Quartz Creek, you see that work. If you drive around Girdwood, you see them doing towers from 115 to 230. AEA, we purchased a line from Homer that had multiple lawsuits on it. It was a whole issue with utilities, but we worked through those issues. We purchased it. Now we're upgrading that line, doubling the capacity of it. We have the grant from the feds for $206 million. The utilities work together with AEA to get that $400 million upgrade done. And then you look individually, you have 307, which kind of sets on top of everything that we're doing. But the utilities and AEA with the governor and the governor's team, we've done an awful lot in 5 years that probably hadn't been done in the last 20 years. You even can look at Golden Valley. They're looking at a long-term battery storage at Healy. That wasn't thought of 5 years ago. We have Tesla batteries or BESSes setting in Kenai now, in Anchorage, and working with Golden Valley on theirs. AEA invested $28 million in those batteries to help us with Bradley. So I think when you look back, we've had we want to have that ERO that was there. The RRC was originally stood up. 307 was stood up. We've done an awful lot, and this just helps us move further down the line. And maybe there will be a time that we'll look back in 5 years and go, we need to tweak that and tweak that this. But right now on the rail belt, on the AEA side, between the SQ upgrades, doing Dixon diversion, increasing Bradley by 50%, and the HVDC line, that's $800 million worth of work that wasn't even on the drawing board 5 years ago, 3 years ago. And now the utilities and AEA are all working to make that happen by 2032. So when you look back on the rail belt and you look at the work that's been done by all the parties, including the RRC, we've done yeoman's work, and it's just keeping that momentum going. It's just one of those things you kind of look at it from a holistic approach. But 5 years ago, I don't think we had talked about spending $800 million on the rail belt, just on the AEA side, not counting what GVA is doing or Chugach or MEA or Homer, and they're doing stuff in addition to it. So there's a lot of work still to be done, but we're doing an awful lot.
And I would mirror everything that Curtis says on that front. And Jeremy, I kind of wanted to follow up because you talked about, kind of the economics and what is the best way with, I think it was kind of focused on transmission for getting lower cost energy. But really what stood out to me in Iceland was the way they approached their generation, and they were bringing on industrial customers with long-term contracts so that they could then build out the generation needs to serve those entities, knowing that, they weren't going to make any profit for those 25 years of those initial contracts, but to bring that energy in, be able to build out that generation resource. And that ended up being a major, major benefit for all the residents of Iceland at that point in time, the thing that really stood out to me was, Iceland is a little bit smaller than what the rail belt is for total number of meters on the system, but their load is astronomically higher, like 5 to 6 times higher. And it's because of all the industry that's been brought in. And so I would say the thing that really stood out to me with Iceland is that the government reached out, they attracted this industry in, made up these contracts in order to build out the generation that, anytime you're looking at generation, economies of scale is where it's at. So they're able to get this lower cost energy onto their system because of that step. So I think from my standpoint, that was a bigger cost driver on bringing costs down for the residents in Iceland, was bringing in this industrial load in order to help spread those costs among more kilowatt hour sales.
Thanks, Travis. You scooped me. That's where I was going with the next question. And I guess I will ask maybe Gwen and Ellie to follow up a little bit on that. And just putting in context, I think Ellie will probably hear more about it tomorrow. We heard about it this morning with Gwen's talk a little bit, but the chicken and egg situation, right? We need to do simultaneously. We need to get more demand so we can decrease costs, but we need to have more generation. And so how did Iceland handle that?
Yeah, and I know Ellie's been putting a lot of work into this, because I think that's interesting, Travis, that was like that was a major takeaway from you from going over there. And has been something that's also interested me, because when we're looking at building out these assets, like whether it's Dixon Diversion or Susitna or, the Shovel Creek Wind Farm, we're usually thinking about it as existing domestic loads that we're meeting. And what Iceland really did instead is say, hey, we want to build the Susitna Dam, right? We want to build Susitna Wantana. How can we get a customer that's going to guarantee, some kind of a long-term contract so we can actually build this thing out, knowing that, yes, the Icelandic population isn't going to benefit immediately from the energy, but they do benefit from the transmission assets that are built out in conjunction with that, right? And so it's pretty interesting because I feel like we've never had those kinds of conversations, or we haven't thought about the build out of assets the same way in Alaska, I guess. And so to Travis and Curtis, I'm kind of curious about your reflection on thinking about things that way. And Ellie, I don't know if you want to chime in here on a little bit, because you've really done some work on what are the mechanics of these kinds of contractual arrangements, right? Because it is a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. I will revisit my first comment here, and that's long-term planning. And that goes long-term planning for everybody. It has, the first smelter was attracted to Iceland, it got, as Gwen told before, I think it was Travis, told that, Iceland wasn't making any profit of those investments for very, very many years. There were 40 years of power purchasing agreements between the first smelter and the state of Iceland. The state of Iceland, of course, owned the hydro facilities that was developed in tandem with that factory. And for the second factory, there were similar things. And even for the huge large smelter in the east of Iceland, which they built out for 690 megawatt hydro generating site for, they got 40 years of PPA, power purchasing agreement. And that was part of it, that they were just simply hedging themselves for risk. It reduces the risk for everybody. It reduces the risk for the government, for that is financing the production. It reduces the risk for the off-taker of the power, and so on and so forth. So I think that is one of the keys. The state of Iceland used or established, or did that strategically, established a business development entity that actually was mandated to attract a large off-taker. We had, I think, I'm really not sure, but in that company was mainly mandated to look into the smelting industry. Iceland had good experience with the smelting industry, but we need to be careful that, though we are talking about smelting industry Iceland, we are not talking about that would be the exact solution for Alaska, but that worked for Iceland. But there are plenty of other off-takers than the smelting industry that are in this picture, I would say.
Yeah, so thanks, Ellie and Gwen. And so we're talking about pretty sizable investments and planning is obviously a part of that. And I guess, in Alaska, as we think about our context, maybe this is a question for Curtis and Andrew, where might that financing come from in Alaska? Would that be private financing? That would probably be ideal. What about the Green Bank or ADIA? Would they be able to maybe think about financing some of these types of projects, upgrades?
I'll tackle that because we're actually going down that path right now with Dixon Diversion, as well as looking at the GRIP and the financing of that. There's a lot of opportunity out there. People want to invest in infrastructure, especially utility infrastructure. So where that might have been a more difficult conversation 10 or 15 years ago, that's not a hard conversation today. The federal government still has a loan office, and they're offering very attractive terms, basically 4% money. And so there's a lot of private public partnerships interested. And when I say there's a lot of money looking at investing, it's not only private equity firms, it's pension funds, and in some cases it's overseas investment. because it looks to be a safe place. I'm gonna step back onto Susitna-Wantana. Susitna-Wantana was started back. Well, it had many start dates over the last 60 years, but the last serious effort was back in 2011. And one of the biggest issues is you were building a dam that was over 600 megawatts, 618 megawatts. Utility and domestic use would be probably about 400 megawatts, and you had 200 megawatts you didn't know what to do with. And how are you going to finance that? Now we look 15 years later, and financing that is not a problem. You have people with $5-6 billion that are looking for a rate of return for the next 50 years. And that 200 megawatts, that would be our data centers. But 15 years ago, data centers were not part of our vocabulary. And it was the big unknown is who's going to use that other third of the power by that one project? And that's where, I think we hesitated as a state. But where Iceland, they built their Susitna-Wantana, 70% on hydro. So they took that leap of faith. We didn't. They're reaping rewards from it. And I think for us, we need to continue to look to see now we're upgrading our transmission lines. Transmission lines need to be updated or upgraded 10, 20 years ago. But we're doing that. And, with the gas line off the North Slope, if Susitna-Wantana is still in play, we have the opportunities to get power and get the data centers and other industries to Alaska. It's just the fact that this again, I think it goes back to the RTO. It's a first great step. Getting utilities united, getting the planning done, and getting a robust transmission line so we can handle that power and identifying that power and what we need to put into the system.
Yeah, I guess I would piggyback on that a little bit in terms of if you look at where global investment is looking because of this tremendous surge in demand around data centers, AI, and the lack of transmission capacity, not just in Alaska, but everywhere, the lack of generation to meet this. People are talking about they need a gigawatt. There's not just spare gigawatts of capacity sitting around on the grid waiting to be dispatched. I mean, this generation has to be built, transmission has to be built, and there's a lot of people willing to invest in this type of future. And I think when you have a confluence of events like right now where you have a federal administration that is openly from, the floor of the House cheerleading for the Alaska LNG project, and you look at where Iceland had the opportunity to enter into long-term agreements, right, with their state-owned assets, I think you look at Alaska has that potential as well, where you can look at entities like data centers and talk about multiple entities that have approached about multiple gigawatts. And we've always looked at the in-state demand as not being part of the economics of this project. But now I think when you look at some folks are looking at, building in-state, there is in-state, could be potentially much larger in-state demand for Alaska's natural gas. I mean, and that could allow, to underpin the economics, that could get a spur over to Fairbanks, where they could have a different source of fuel versus naphtha and oil. I mean, I think which then opens up other mining opportunities in their region. I mean, I think that this project and this opportunities that we have now that we didn't have even a year ago, based on just a simple thing as a change in federal administration, and then combined with the global interest in investment in the United States. We met with folks when we were in the UAE that they have an investment in the East Coast where they are upgrading old transmission lines because they have long patient capital, and they look at transmission as like, you're getting a per kilowatt, something every month. This company invested in parking meters in Chicago because it's just steady income, right? And so when you look at transmission and steady load and long-term power agreements, I mean, I think we have a great opportunity. We just have to capitalize on it and not get shy about it or not see the big picture. I think about Bradley Lake. I mean, it was a very difficult process to get that approved, but I think we're all glad that people did have vision back then. And I think one thing that we've lacked for over the last few decades in Alaska, not that I've been here for all of them, is a lack of vision and to look beyond who's going to be the governor in 2 years. I mean, I think that's something that's constantly plagued Alaska in terms of getting big things done. And I think if we have a tremendous opportunity, and it's, hopefully that we will seize it this time.
Great. Thanks, Andrew and Curtis. Yeah, it's good to hear that the, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think we would have heard those long-term investment horizons because people were thinking about startups and short-term kind of Silicon Valley type investments. So it's good to hear that people are now starting to think about those long-term investments because that's a real need, obviously. You touched on a couple of things there. We're going to hear a lot more about data-driven growth for the next couple hours here. But you also touched on mining, and I'm going to hand it over to put Travis on the spot to talk a little about Fort Knox and the role it plays in Golden Valley's generation and distribution, and basically the load demand there and how that affects GVA rates.
Yeah, Jeremy, on that one, I mean, Golden Valley is a little bit unique compared to the other rail belt utilities to where a large portion of our load is industrial. About 30% of our load is made up of 2 mining entities that we serve. And, I mean, just basic economics looks at if you have a set cost to produce energy and to serve your members and your load, every additional kilowatt hour you're spreading that over reduces the cost for everybody. So, having those large industrial members on our system definitely helps keep the rates low. Even though we are, as was mentioned before, by Andrew, is the fact that we are reliant on naphtha type products and liquid fossil fuels, and those are some of the more expensive ways to produce electricity in our system. But unfortunately, we don't have natural gas in Fairbanks. We don't have, other than our percentage share of Bradley, we don't have a lot of hydro assets available in our area. So, that's really what drives the cost up. But I can say that without the mining loads on our system, the cost would be even more expensive for our members.
Kind of want to kind of highlight that point a little bit more specifically there, Travis, because, when we look at this sort of economies of scale or scope or whatever in Iceland, and I do kind of think about the Golden Valley area as being kind of a miniature version and much smaller version of this particular kind of phenomena. We see rates as being fairly high in Fairbanks because you've got a fairly high component of fuel cost, right? And so that kind of washes out. When you look at Golden Valley, your operational costs are actually lower than the other rail belt utilities. And I think that's because of what you're seeing, where you've got these large industrial customers and you're spreading those fixed costs across, these kilowatt hour sales. And so it looks like Golden Valley is more efficient or charges less per kilowatt hour, for kind of base operations where you're not looking at fuel and generation costs specifically. That's at least my observation. I haven't talked to you about that, but I do attribute that to these large industrial customers that are doing a little bit of the miniature thing of what Iceland's doing. And if they went away, our rates would go up substantially, not because we're paying more for fuel, but because those fixed costs have to be paid by somebody, and that would be the ratepayers in Fairbanks rather than these industrial loads that are sharing in that cost.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that, Glenn. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head to verify your claim that our base rates are at a lower cost than the other rail belt utilities. But if they are, that would make a lot of sense. But I mean, obviously our COPA, our cost of power for fuel and purchase power is definitely a lot higher than all the rest of the rail belt for sure. But yeah, I mean, you're spot on to where, again, the more energy sales you have, the more kilowatt hour sales you have, those fixed costs are going to remain fixed no matter how many kilowatt hours are being put out. And so, yeah, larger industrials are definitely driving down those costs for the rest of our membership.
Thanks. So I'm going to switch it over to some of the questions in the chat here. I think you guys have been answering a lot of these questions, but I'll just get some specific answers. So one of the questions is, does the current federal administration emphasis threaten the economic or policy case for transition of Alaska's grid? And I think there's an easy answer to this, but I'll put it out to the panel.
Would you repeat the question?
It's basically, does the current federal administration emphasis on fossil fuel energy resources and removal of greenhouse gas reduction incentives threaten the economic or policy case for transition of Alaska's grid?
I think I'll take that on. In just when you look at the work that's being done on the transmission line, we're agnostic to the fuel source. The upgrades need to be done no matter what's been moving on it. When you look at it, we have federal support for upgrading the transmission line. The Dixon diversion, we don't have a federal ask. We don't have federal money into that as a state asset. But when you look at, we have AEA through our REF program, has money, early money into Shovel Creek and into Little Susitna, which are wind projects. Those are moving forward to my knowledge. And so I think, again, we're agnostic, whether it be wind or solar or that. Grids are coming a lot more complicated to operate, hence the battery systems now to help manage those. But I haven't seen anything from the administration that's going to hamper our growth opportunities and what we're doing on the transmission line whatsoever. I think it's actually an encouragement in some of the work that we're going to be doing when you have to, when we look at our undersea cable for 40 miles, that's going to, it's going to have a full environmental review and permitting and everything like that. And the encouragement is to upgrade transmission lines and to help streamline the review process. Same thing when we do Dixon diversion. Again, we're going to be filing with FERC, and FERC has new guidance too as far as permitting, also as far as trying to get it done quickly. Still being a robust process, but still being done a lot quicker than it is right now.
The thing I would just add to that is, the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, has been very specific on numerous occasions that he wants Alaskans to decide Alaskans' future. So, I mean, I think that if folks in Alaska want wind and solar, sources of power, that's largely going to be in our hands, other than, this current pause on federal permitting around wind projects. Now, I think that's something that'll work itself out in time as the administration settles in, as more of the deputies, et cetera, and cases can be made. But, the Energy Secretary has been very specific that he wants Alaskans to decide what happens up here. So yeah, obviously there's a shift in administration from, things that were really being mandated and forced upon us. And so I think that now we have an opportunity to sort of maybe chart our own course more. So it's definitely a change in direction, but I think we have an administration that wants Alaska to set its own course.
And to piggyback a little bit on Andrew's comment there is, what I've been telling our members and when I'm out in public talking is, man, the political pendulum that is swinging in the energy industry has been crazy. And it's, when we're planning projects, I mean, we're not planning 1 to 2 year projects. Most of our projects, especially for generation we're looking at, are looking out 20, 30, 40 years. And to have these swings that go from, one side to the other, and you're trying to plan these things out, just makes it extremely difficult. From my standpoint, I think I'm pretty agnostic as well on what the generation source is, as long as it can reduce the cost to our membership. Regarding kind of the question, Jeremy, I think maybe what they're getting at a little bit is some of the federal government subsidies, in particular with wind and solar. And what I can say is that, obviously, if those subsidies or tax credits or anything go away, at the end of the day, the cost per megawatt hour for those type of projects most likely is going to go up. But it's really hard to say today what that really looks like and what that cost is going to be. And that's some of the processes we're working through right now, as mentioned on the Shovel Creek project and some others that we're looking at, is going through the integration and the regulation studies to really get what that cost of power is going to be for our members. And that's one of the questions we get all the time. Why haven't we signed PPAs on these projects? Well, they're not to that point yet in order to determine what that cost is to our membership to sign them. So we're going to find out a lot more probably here in the near couple months on what those end costs will end up being if subsidies are pulled back or tax credits or what have you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and I guess just to summarize, the transmission upgrades are just, they're agnostic as to where the electrons are coming from, right? And they're a necessary part. Even in the absence of renewable generation, the expectation is that we see more power moving up and down the rail belt because of that increased load that we want to drive down the costs. So yeah, my sense is, and it's agreement with everybody so far, is that we're not going to see any changes especially on the transmission side of things, and that's a necessary step, regardless, for a variety of reasons. One other, let's see, we're coming up on time here, but I've got one other kind of easy question, I think, is what the relationship between increasing transmission and reliability and expanding Alaska's renewable energy portfolio? Is there essential help, hinder, etc.? What's that relationship? We'll talk about that a little bit.
So I'll try to take the start of that and see if that leads to good follow-ups on the other's part. But yeah, one of the things that we recognized early on through our process of evaluating, large renewable projects on our system is there are transmission constraints to where we're running into potential thermal limitations on our existing system. A lot of that goes back to how electric systems were originally designed, where you had central station power in a certain spot, and then you have larger transmission coming from that, then it stepped down to distribution. So I look at that as, you're starting from the hub of a large city, you got all your freeways going out, and the further out you start getting into the backcountry roads. Well, now the locations of, whether it's renewable or other generation sources are on the outskirts, kind of out in the country. And you're finding that trying to bring that power back to the load center in that main part of the city, you've got constraints throughout. So we are finding that there are many constraints, whether it's for renewables or any other generation source. The model of having generation in one spot, centrally located to your load is getting flipped on its head. And by doing that, we're finding that there is a need for additional transmission throughout the system, no matter where your generation source is going to be. And that's the process we're working through right now, is recognizing that, we're going to have to build out additional transmission even within Golden Valley's system, agnostic of the rail belt transmission, in order to integrate any of these projects going forward.
Thanks, Travis. So we're getting up on time here. I just wanted to provide anybody with opportunity for last comments, and then after that, we'll head into a break. And I'll start with Curtis. Anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I just want to thank you again for doing this. I think these series are important just to help understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, and working together moving forward. And really, I think this is the first time that we as a group has really talked about the benefits of 307. And I think, to see, kind of check in now that the bill's been signed and now we're in another legislative session, where we're at with the process. And so again, thank you very much for hosting and allowing us to give everybody an update.
Thank you, Curtis. I'll hand it to Andrew.
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. And yes, I would echo what Curtis said in just thanking you and ASAP for your continued support for these webinars, and of course for the Sustainable Energy Conference, which is coming up June 3rd through 5th. I will just get a plug in for that now. Registration is open. We still have early bird pricing, and we have several big announcements that we can't make yet, but they are coming, and I think folks should definitely take advantage of early bird pricing now. But yeah, I mean, I think, yes, 307 is something where it's very significant, but it's also important that we manage expectations in terms of the time and the process that it will take. It's not going to be easy. I think Curtis had the good analogy about family. The complications of executing it are going to be substantial, but it's steps that are long overdue, and I'm appreciative of the work the utilities have been doing, and we'll continue to work on improving the system and then building out the infrastructure that's necessary. So thank you again for hosting, and alaskasustainableenergy.com is the website.
Thanks, Andrew. Travis, last comments.
Yeah, just echo what what Curtis and Andrew said. Again, back to Andrew, you and the governor's office, just appreciate the leadership on getting 307 across the line. I think it's a good first step in this process. Want to thank ASAP obviously for this roundtable was very helpful, but honestly the biggest help for me was when we went back to Iceland and actually getting to see it, getting to meet with the leadership back there to really understand more of the process that they went through. And Ellie obviously for pulling all that together and getting us in the door with these folks. And I mean, you can see presentations all day long, you can read white papers about it, but actually to be there and be able to ask questions and see it firsthand for me was invaluable. So I just thank Gwen, you and the team for making that happen.
Thanks, Travis. With that, we'll hand it off to Gwen and then Ellie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only last minute comments that I really want to say is that, when we were working on explaining the value of HB 307, we really talked about the transmission system as being this, superhighway for electrons that are kind of agnostic of, what the generation source is. And so for me, I feel like really having a strong transmission backbone and a way of managing that electron flow along that superhighway really opens us up. It gives us a lot of optionality in terms of what our future energy mix is. And so like from my perspective, it kind of creates a pull. It's more of like a carrot approach rather than a stick approach. And it's something that I think that is to everybody's mutual benefit. And so that's kind of why this focus in my mind on transmission, so that it opens us up to all kinds of different options, whether it's new customers or new generation, has been really important. And I think less appreciated than, the idea of getting new generation or more renewables online. To do that, we need to really set ourselves up to create that market. So I'll just end with that and pass it to Ellie.
Yeah, thank you. Dear panelists, thank you for sharing this opportunity with me. I'm really grateful for being here with you. I would like to remind you that that I will dive into, shortly after the break, I will dive into more details about the history of the load growth policy in Iceland. So just hang on. And I would like to see you there as well. You can ask me questions on that and this. For the rest of collaboration with Iceland, what we can pick up from there, just waiting for next assignments and more policy tours and such things. So I'm ready to go on for that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks to the panelists.
Our next presentation is on data-driven growth, what Alaska can learn from Iceland's energy-powered data center industry. To continue with our program, please help me to welcome Erlinger, Ellie Gudlefsen, and Christopher Christensen. Ellie is an energy researcher at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he focuses on sustainable energy solutions for Arctic and remote communities. With a strong interest in applying lessons for Iceland's successful energy model, he works on integrating economic, environmental, and social perspectives to develop resilient energy systems in Alaska. Christopher brings a multidisciplinary background at the intersection of commercial strategy and IT infrastructure. He has a strong focus on data center services, high-performance computing, AI workloads, and traditional enterprise applications. In recent years, he's been closely involved in B2B or business to business and B2C business to consumer marketing strategy for infrastructure as a service offerings, co-location solutions, and hybrid cloud models, with particular emphasis on customer experience, digital channels, and automation. He has worked extensively with organizations seeking to optimize for high availability environments, latency-sensitive applications, and compute-intensive workloads such as AI training, AI simulation, and scientific research. If you have any questions, as with the rest of this workshop for our presenters, please put them in the chat, and we will get to them during the panel discussion directly after. Welcome, and welcome, Erlinger.
Yeah, developing the heavy industry evolution in Iceland. My name is Erlingur Guðleifsson. Most people in Alaska call me Ellie. I am researcher with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and have been since 2023. I work for Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and I work also for Alaska Blue Economy Center doing fisheries research. I've mainly been looking into, if you look at Iceland, you know that, or some might know that Iceland is an islanded or isolated energy system, and so is Alaska. So we could maybe assume in some cases, and that is what my research is all about. We could assume that same economic and social principle would apply into similar Arctic isolated energy regions. So what we will look into, the load growth in Iceland. Where does it come from, and how did it start? Iceland produces more than 20 terawatt hours of electricity annually. 70% of that is hydro, 30% is geothermal, and that's mostly it. And 80% of those 20 terawatt hours, they go to the heavy industry sector in Iceland. You have to be consuming 80 gigawatt hours annually at the same place to be classified as a heavy industrial user in Iceland. But all this generation didn't come, just overnight. There was this. I recently found out that it was actually the post-war Marshall Plan that is claimed by historians in Iceland to be the first example of load growth, simultaneous load growth, where investment in generation and building of industry goes hand in hand. We have the smelter as well today, as many know. We have the alloys, fish meal, and district heating are using quite a lot of energy. And we have data centers. So the Marshall Plan, as we mentioned before, it was this post-war European, to say, developing aid that the United States provided to Europe to actually try to get the economy in Europe back going. Actually, the purpose of the Marshall Plan was to break down custom tariffs and business barrier between countries, and that is a bit of a contradiction nowadays, but we will leave it there. In Iceland, the Marshall Plan included hydro generation projects, two such projects, 32 megawatts and 8 megawatt project, a fertilizer production factory. The fisheries sector benefited heavily from the Marshall Aid, where Iceland managed to buy state-of-the-art new ships and freezing equipment and processing equipment, and the agricultural sector as well got modernized, if you can say, by buying tractors and machinery and so on and so forth. But let's leave it a bit with those two first bullets, hydro generation and fertilizer production factory, because that is, as I mentioned before, what historians claim today was the first example in Iceland where there was a build-out of hydro generation and the off-taker of that energy at the same time. Of course, this is a 32 megawatt project, and the fertilizer factory you see in the grayscale picture did not consume all that energy. But the energy and the generation side made that possible. Nowadays, we can dwell a little bit longer with the fertilizer factory. It actually was it was an American factory. It was a combination of ammonia, hydrogen, and an acid factory and a mixing factory, and it had a monopoly that supported its existence until 1995. That factory, unfortunately, had a quite big explosion in 2001. At that time, the area around the factory was mainly occupied by buildings, and it was a residential area. So they decided to, sunset that project and remove the equipment. Nowadays, this is the big storage house that was going along with was part of that factory, and looks pretty bad. But what it has been done now in Iceland, it was this large Icelandic movie studio that bought those facilities and are actually turning it into quite big movie production site. They have already built out that one that is on the seaside in the picture. You see they're a bit far out, and the big one in the center in front of you is actually this old tired building, and hopefully they will manage to do it. This industry has had a great incentives in Iceland over the years and has been growing. But if I pull you back a little bit to a more conventional load growth dialogues, Iceland is more known for load growth in relation with aluminum smelters. That path started in 1969 when Iceland when they attracted this large conglomerate, Aluswiss, I think it was the name, and built out in the South Highlands of Iceland a pretty large, I think 200 plus megawatt hydro generating site. Not the whole factory went, the whole energy went into the smelting factory, but vast majority it was connected directly to the generating site with a transmission line and so on and so forth. In 1979, Iceland started to build out alloy factories, and alloy factories produce ferrosilicium or ferrosilica, that is a chemical compound that's used for the steel industry. And also, as I mentioned before, fish meal factories in Iceland can operate solely on electricity nowadays. They have electrical boilers and air heaters, electric air heaters. And also there is ongoing policy in Iceland to try to get as much of the remaining district heating that is not fueled by geothermal into the electrical grid as well. But data centers, that is actually what is the newest rival in the load growth in Iceland. There is a dialogue in Iceland now talking about e-fuels and wind farms, but those projects are still just in discussions, and I think there isn't any of them in any particular permitting process. We see here, for example, that the aluminum industry consumes 80% of the heavy industry energy in Iceland. The alloy industry 9, data center industry 7.5, something like that, and the aluminum foil factory only 4%. But what I would like to really emphasize on in relation with data centers and growth of industry and load growth policy is that evidence show that it is not a singular investment. Iceland did not overnight start to sell 80% of the load growth energy, if you can say, industrial sector energy, to aluminum smelter. It's an incremental long-term planning process, as I would look at it. Because if you look at the left side of the picture, you see the first smelter that was established in 1969. It only consumed 60 megawatts at the time of at the year of commission. Now it consumes 390 megawatts, or is connected with 390 megawatts of electricity. Same story is with the Iceland's second largest smelters in the outskirts of Reykjavik, in the west region. They consumed 107 megawatts to begin with, but are almost up to 550 today. So this actually tells a story that, you know, when big companies take decision make a decision of establishing a business in Iceland, you see this tendency of a growth in the business over the years. The heavy industry, if you look at those 8 years that this chart covers, only you can see that it is a relatively stable process, you know, that hasn't been very much of a change. But the change we can see is this with this new emerging sector, and that is the data center industry. actually consumes now almost up to 10% of the energy, and has had experienced this incremental growth of annually 44% growth since 2015. And that is, I think, a key finding here for me, at least as a researcher, to see that, and if you look at the economy and long-term effects, you look at the planning, and that the industry, no matter if it's aluminum smelter or data center, they really need long-term planning in the energy market to actually have a chance of making long-term investments. And we can say that the aluminum industry have had those long-term investments, and hopefully we will see the data center industry in that category as well a little bit later on. But with those words, I really would like to close my introduction on the data center or the load growth in relation to data center, the short historical brief, and turn it over to Christopher Christensen. He's Director of Sales and Products at Borealis Data Center, one of the big ones in Iceland. So, Christopher, please.
Well, thank you, Erling.
It
was a pleasant introduction. So yes, as many of you have seen, we are entering the era of AI. So my name is Christopher, and I come from the Borealis Data Centers. We operate 4 sites around the Nordics. And I want to deep a little bit into how it is building a data center so far north, Iceland being an island between the Europe and the US, and how our story has been and how we're seeing the demand of data center capacity growing. So maybe this is our take on data centers operations. Data centers can operate as a part of a sustainable green industry where energy resources are transformed into digital products and delivered anywhere in the world in the blink of an eye. So many of you may know that laying a fiber cable in the ocean is a lot cheaper than adding large electrical infrastructure to travel, to move electricity between point A and B. And the good thing about moving data is that you won't have any loss in that system. So how Icelanders have been solving the additional cost of transport is to continue to build its data center as one main and largest user of electricity. But we have taken somewhat of a different approach than your traditional data centers. This is our campus up in the north. As you can see, it's located in the nice area of Blönduós. You can see the horses running around free and the beautiful landscape of Iceland. And this tends to become quite snowy during wintertime. So Borealis hit a anniversary last year. We became 10 years old, but the idea formed all the way back in 2010. At that time, blockchain was taking a big form in Europe. And there's one thing about the success stories of Iceland is that blockchain created the initial investments to create these large AI data centers of the Nordics. So in 2014, we got our first anchor customer. We built in a brownfield, meaning that we took an old military base of the US in Keflavik. We retrofitted it for computer hardware. There were 4 founders, and our CEO and co-founder was one of them, Björn Brynjolfsson. And after 4 years of operations, a European company called Ethics Everywhere acquired the majority stake of Borealis in the aim to attain a large anchor customer. So this is a quite interesting point because there's a lot of capital that's willing to been put into data centers. And at that time, we built 2 data centers with the scalability of 150 megawatts. So we became quite the large player, and not as big as the hyperscalers like Google and Amazon, but in an Icelandic scale, we became quite big. And the story goes on. 2 years later, the American data center company Vantage acquires Ethics to gain an entry point into the FLAP-D market, which is Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Dublin, as well as Paris. And Ethics had a lot of greenfields where Vantage came and started to build their foundation in Europe. Iceland being a small island in the north, Vantage was not so interested in building out there. So Borealis was sold to a France infrastructure fund called Wuban Infrastructure Partner. And from there, we changed our shape quite a lot. We added our 3rd site, which was in Reykjavik, and we started expanding outside of Iceland. In 2023, the AI boom starts, and we lock in the first AI customer. And 2 years later, we have a full 50 megawatt site filled with dozens of US and European enterprise customers running AI workloads. And last year, we expanded into Finland, next to one of the European supercomputers, Lumi. Now, I'll go a little bit into the details. But these are our 4 sites. We have the expansion capacity of a total 250, and we're reaching an operational capacity of 100 megawatts by end of this year. Now, this is something that you should be familiar with. It's the white snow. It's the cold location. Now, the cold has served us extremely well. Fitjar campus, all our 3 campuses in Iceland are strategically located to meet a certain type of workloads, which I'll go into a little later. But Fitjar campus is located next to the international airport Keflavik and serves as a hub for complex hardware that needs specialists to come and do hardware swaps due to the complexity of the hardware. The Reykjavik campus is the heart of IT of Iceland. There, all the critical infrastructure is sourced, the banking systems, the government, and the municipalities, along with the largest managed service providers of Iceland. And in Blönduós in the north, next to one of our larger and awarded hydro stations, we have our Blönduós campus. As you can see, each campus has different type of a target to acquire to a different type of consumers. And again, in the cold area, our Kajaani campus is located in the center of Finland, and is a brownfield site, meaning that it's been built into an old paper mill. We're able to use 90% of the heat that's generated, and that's 12 megawatt of heat, which is then distributed into the local community, meaning that now you don't need to use electricity to heat. You use data centers to heat the base water, which you supply to the district or the town of Kajaani. Now, this is an extremely interesting point because these eco parks have been popping up in the Nordics quite a lot. Eco data centers is a 4-way party where the data center could generate heat. The heat goes into a shellfish farm and agriculture, and the leftovers there go into the next. So it's a circle. So they use the electricity to the fullest. And this is what we've seen is lacking so much in Central Europe and some places in the US, because essentially what you're doing in data centers, you're generating a new form of electricity of energy, which is heat out of the electricity. And it is the European incentives to put a demand that whenever there's a possibility, data center heat should be converted into the local districts. Now, another thing that being so north provides competitive advantage on is we can provide a unique position to the rest of the world, and that's sustainability. One of the core focus is being a leader in sustainable data centers, and we're dedicated on helping businesses embrace the sustainable practices for the future. And in Iceland, we have power with less than 1 gram of carbon dioxide, which is almost net zero. The power uses effectiveness, which is essentially the measurement between how much your computer uses and how much it needs to cool it down and keep it running. So, for example, a PUE of 1.1 is for every 1 megawatt, you need 100 kilowatts or 0.1 megawatt on running that compute. The international average is around 1.5 today, at least in the US and Europe. The EU incentives is to get down to 125 and further to 115. But we've been running on 1.02 and 1.03 for the last decade. And this is done thanks to the strategic advantage and being in such a cold climate. Then, of course, it's the access to renewable energy, and Iceland is ranked 1 in social equality and security, and Finland is ranked 1 in business environment and happiness. So we pick our places where we feel good. But the point of this is to talk about the data center industry, where it's going, and how to pick a correct data center moving forward. In 2023, NVIDIA and OpenAI introduced the expansion into artificial intelligence, generative AI. And since then, the market demand for AI capacity and data center capacity has skyrocketed and is set to not being able to sustain 2 years in the future. And how can we continue building data centers without it affecting the world? These are our 6 key takeaways on when we pick a new site. Where you can get access to low carbon emission from electrical production. That's either through hydro, geothermal, wind, solar, and ocean energy, but also from nuclear. Of course, nuclear is discussed if it's renewable or not, but nuclear is also has 0 carbon emission. Next is the natural cooling thanks to the cold climate. But essentially, what's the most expensive part of running a data center in Silicon Valley, in mainland Europe, is the climate. But if you have an average temperature that exceeds 20 degrees, that means that you need to use chemical cooling to cool the facility down to the set rate. And the hotter the climate is, the more expensive it is to run the data center, which in the end returns that the prices are higher and the operational cost for the consumer is higher. Access to skilled labor is extremely important. Access to renewable energy and low PUE, so low due to the cooling through the advanced design of modern data center technology, and it's the access to the northern hemisphere cable routes. But what's been building up is there's so much compute happening in the north that there are dozens of projects on finding how we can further utilize the clean energy that's generated in the north to produce the compute for the world. Now, again, on sustainability, the global average is 440 grams per kilowatt hour. This is only on the electricity. This is not scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. This is only on the electrical production. This means that the CO footprint of data centers are quite high. And this is our target. The European target is 100 grams, and we are currently at 0.38 grams, which is less than 0.1% of the target goal. It's less than 0.01. So this is also quite important to take into the future, so we can maintain this rapid growth of data centers. Now, from a customer perspective, there are 8 things that they prefer when they're choosing. Location is key, but being placed in Europe or US is almost a minimum criteria for US customers and European customers. The next thing is connectivity, and that's being able to connect with a good connection speed to the data center, the cost or the operational cost through the power usage effectiveness to minimize the cost of running their equipment, the resiliency of the design, the price of the lease, and you can see that's quite low, sustainability, type of workload, and latency. So to go deeper into a little bit of the technical, workloads are divided into 3 parts. It's the traditional workloads, and here I have a unit that's generated per kilowatt. High availability is your traditional workload. When you go on the internet and you go to a website, you go to something that is hosted usually on a high availability server, because that customer doesn't want his website to go down. This might be your banking systems, your transaction systems, it's the trading market. It's everything that needs to be up and running all of the time. This is the most expensive data centers because they're built not to fail. And the trick with high availability data centers is for workloads that are latency intensive. High availability data centers are usually not the way to go. And a story from Iceland is the Icelandic data centers that have started with being a high availability data centers have unfortunately never seen the end. They've either had to be resold or had to merge to keep alive. The simple reason it's extremely expensive to keep a high availability data centers running. In essentials, you have power and you have a housing, so you need electricity and housing to run. High availability data centers, there you have a double design, so it's built not to fail. The next type is what we're seeing now is the high performance compute and what is now artificial intelligence. 2-3 years back, this used to be the rendering of a cartoon movie. It could be aerodynamics for a car when they were trying to produce the best cars, or the Formula 1 uses HPC a lot. It's large scale data analytics, and now this has moved more into the generative AI. And either large language models or so all in all, AI workloads, they require a lot of compute. And to put this into perspective, a traditional workload uses a one rack like we see here, uses on average between the same amount as the maximum uses of a household. One of these machines, they use as much as a single rack in high availability. So they use 4 times more power, and that's the current versions. The future is that these will get denser and denser and denser. So the next generation will triple, or the current generation of GP200 from NVIDIA. Those will have 135 kilowatts per rack, which is about 16 to 7 households, a large house. And in 2 years, Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA, has announced that he will continue growing the density of these racks. And the future rack will be up to 600 kilowatts, which is a size of a traditional data center 5-6 years back. A 1 megawatt data center was a decent data center. This means that AI will need more and more power in a very, very cramped and narrow space, meaning that the cost to build goes down, but it requires a lot of capacity in a very short time frame. And this is what has created a new hype in the market. There are so many data centers in the Nordics coming online. Everyone wants to be a part of catching that race. But the limitation is the infrastructure within mainland Europe and mainland US. And now Project Stargate was announced by President Trump, and that is to continue the competitive advantage of the US to be the forefront and the leading developer and producer of artificial intelligence. So the demand is not to double or triple, it's to quadruple in the next 4 to 6 years on that particular workload. The last workload, and we can see here that the value gained from a high performance or artificial intelligence is $140. So it's a lot less per electricity unit, but these are a lot larger scales. And the last type of workloads is something that the general public has very different opinions on. And this is high density or the cryptocurrency mining, indexing, and this new type of currencies. In 2009, the first blockchain data center was built in Iceland, and since then Iceland has moved on. The requirement for this type of workload is an extremely low-cost energy. Norway became a very large blockchain country, somewhat like Iceland, but they've also removed blockchain due to the increased demand on the market. So this is the easiest way to start building out, but it really is very on diverse opinion if this is a sustainable capacity, but it provides a leap jump into building data center industries. What has happened to Iceland is those who had blockchain capacity in Iceland and Norway, they've gone to South America and Africa, where they've been investing in electricity projects to gain access to a very cheap energy, as this hardware is usually very strong, and it can withstand what normal hardware doesn't. So in the data center world, we use a guideline called outweigh, and basically blockchain can have very high moisture, very hot. So where the Nordics and Europe has been leaving, and this was banned in China back in 2021, I believe. There's still a high demand for these workloads if the electricity is on the right cost, because you can place this wherever. You can have the energy curtailed, so it's no problem to turn this equipment down. So it's quite good to build up electrical infrastructure and invest if it's not completely resilient. So and the challenges with data centers, we saw the demand of electricity for smelters is quite stable. So you turn on a smelter, aluminum smelter, and it uses 99% of the same electricity the whole time. Now, building around a system like that requires that the design should never go down. So the electrical infrastructure is usually over invested when you have such a critical infrastructure, because no one is buying generators for that kind of because the value generated per electricity unit is so low compared to others, like in data centers. But the challenge of the modern data center is this balancing of energy. As you can see, a single 256 node cluster of an NVIDIA H100 goes all the way from 600 kilowatt up to 2.6 megawatts. So this has a tremendous burden on electricity grids, and this is AI workloads. Traditional workloads and high density workloads, they are a lot more stable. But what needs to be done around these, the new type of workload, is you need to have some way to balance this so this doesn't hit the grid. Imagine if you have 100 to 3 a gigawatt of AI workloads, and these spikes would be hitting the electricity grid. It would probably cause some failures within some substations or so what we're developing to balance with the national grid is to provide energy storage for the minimum. We provide UPSs, uninterrupted power supplies, to take on the peaks that is too expensive to invest in energy storage. And we optimize the data centers using AI and future prediction on how the workloads will be. So this doesn't hit the national grid, because as you saw from Erlingur, the demand of data center capacity has been increasing tremendously. But the other thing about this is the value generated. So you need to invest 2.6 megawatts of infrastructure for 2.6 megawatts of hardware. So the $140 per energy unit becomes a lot more, because you don't use the full electricity that's on the grid. So the real revenue generated or from data centers are a lot higher when it comes to this new type of workload. So yeah, there's a lot to go through. This is quite a complex subject, but I hope that I managed to give you a little bit of introduction in data centers. And I'm more than happy if this has piqued any interest, or if you want to dive deeper into the nitty-gritty details. I can go from all the learnings and what we should have done better in the past decade, and what we see is happening in the market that should be avoided, because Norway, for example, had a huge hit. All this infrastructure was built around few customers, and one of the customers defaulted. So Norway had to take a step in. The Norwegian government had to take a step in. But if done properly, this has generated so much revenue. This has become one of the main anchors of revenue generating for the Icelandic nation. It provides a stable growth. It provides high value jobs. It creates a large ecosystem around it, and you can use this to continue building infrastructure into cities by utilizing the ecosystem ideology of data centers. So I don't know if I'm out of time, but I hope this has provided a little bit of insight. Feel free to reach out at either LinkedIn or via email, and I'm happy to take any one-on-ones if there's any further questions.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for those tremendous insights. This is really, really valuable information and adds plenty on to the dialogue that is ongoing in Alaska. So I would like to offer you to join us in the panel that will be happening now after just a few seconds. Probably Vanessa will bring us into that. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, Christopher. Thank you. And thank you, Ellie, for your presentation as well. So we're going to move into a panel discussion. We'll be talking more about data-driven growth, what Alaska can learn from Iceland's energy-powered data center industry. And now I'm more convinced we have a lot to learn. So thank you. I want to welcome Clay Copeland, Peter Asmus, Erlinger, Ellie, and Christopher to this panel moderated by Isaac Vanderberg, who is the CEO of Launch Alaska. Isaac, I'll leave it to you to make introductions and to get us started, and it's great to see you.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, we're going to be able to hear more from Christopher and Erlinger here in our panel today. So thanks all. It's so good to be here. Instead of taking up precious time going over everyone's bios on this panel, I'm just going to put a link to everyone's LinkedIn in the chat. Hopefully you all received that, so you can look up their bios as you like. But I am joined today by Peter Asmus, Senior Advisor of Microgrid Strategy and Thought Leadership at UAF, Erlinger or Ellie Gulafsson, researcher at UAF Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Clay Copeland, CEO at Cordova Electric Cooperative, and Christopher Christensen, Director and Sales of Products at Borealis Data Center. And like I said, my name is Isaac Vanderberg. I'm the CEO at Launch Alaska. So rather than go into the intros, we're just going to save that time so that we can actually hear from our panelists. We have about an hour for this panel at this point. I'm just going to go ahead and ask some initial questions to our themed panelists here, and we'll kind of let the conversation go where it takes us. And then just a reminder, if folks online have questions, please put those in the chat. And then we'll pull those down at the end of the conversation here and try to get as many of those questions answered as possible. So Ellie, maybe if I can put you on the spot first. It's great seeing you again. You were such a phenomenal guide and expert during our trip to Iceland in October of 2023. Our trip, as I recall it, was really focused on the electricity sector. We had a visit to a carbon capture facility, a pipe manufacturer. We even visited a tomato greenhouse and had tomato beer, which was really fun. But if I recall from that trip, there was not a large focus on data centers. And so I'm wondering if you could just give folks who have just joined a high-level overview of what Iceland is doing with data centers today and what kind of the state of play is in the country.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Isaac, for a great introduction and nice words. It was a great trip. I'm really looking for opportunity to actually repeat that one. Anyhow, like Christopher was saying, is that we are talking about a totally different industry. In my presentation, I talked plenty about the aluminum industry, the most conventional heavy industry, but data centers are classified according to the transmission system operator as heavy industry because of their loads. But though Iceland has had this tremendous success with the other, alloys, aluminum and all that, if you can just say the truth that not all Icelanders are in love with that kind of business. So that has been this struggle in the society for quite many years to actually asking government and asking industrial business leader in Iceland to actually give us some opportunities, something else than the same recipe that has though been successful. So I would say that data centers and the diversity that they bring not only to power consumption as a business sector, but also diversity as development of workforce and creating a society that is built up on more than just one industry or very similar industry has been very welcomed in Iceland. So I think that is from my perspective is a key takeaway, and with notice of the growth that this industry has had, even just the researchers that like me managed to spot out and of course experts like Christopher taught us, we probably just know that where we are heading with load growth of this sector, that I really would like to see this industry growing more here in Iceland.
That's great. And do you have just in broad strokes what the current load is that the sector is in Iceland? Just rough.
I can find it in 3 minutes.
I know it as well. So we have three main data center operation in Iceland. They're called Verne, Atnorth, and Borealis. Verne operates around 30 megawatts. Atnorth operates around 100. And we ourselves have been operating at around 75 megawatts. So it's around 220, 230 on average. And to your question, why not data centers before? So like I mentioned in the presentation, the general view of blockchain is quite low. And this industry was formed by blockchain. So the public has not been informed as much about how we've transcended from that type of workloads into more commercial, more enterprise. We've now moved over to someone mining money into being able to provide these necessary services of improved life.
Makes sense. And so, Christopher, I'm curious. Those are pretty large projects that you mentioned there. About a third or a quarter of the total load on the rail belt here in Alaska. For those of you who are on the rail belt, it's quite a those are pretty large projects. Is that typical of the projects in Iceland? Is that there's a few big ones, or are there smaller entrepreneurial firms that are developing smaller projects?
So the current problem with Iceland is for a large project, we're quite capped at the electrical production. So we can only handle X many additional projects. So we have the inland fisheries. We are competing with all those different new sectors that use little load, but there are many requests. And media, the new design is for hyperscalers is never smaller than 54 megawatts. In essential, some never look at data center site that's smaller than 150 megawatts. So we've gone from 10, 12 megawatts being a decent size into just being a small size. So So the opinion on data center sizes have quite changed a lot in the past 3 years.
Peter, if I can go to you next. I think we've heard some today about the opportunity and what's being done in Iceland. Can you kind of bring this home to us for us to Alaska? What are some of Alaska's advantages for attracting data centers, and maybe some of its disadvantages? And maybe just speak to global trends on data centers and how might that shape Alaska's approach?
Yeah, let me start with the second half of your question first. So yeah, I've been investigating data centers. Actually, I guess the first time was in 2017, and I have to admit, when I went to my first data center conference, I didn't understand half of what people were saying. It reminded me of my early days as an energy guy with all the acronyms and just sort of thinking I understood what a term meant and what it didn't. And I always like to use the example of DR. So in the electricity markets, that's demand response, but in the data center world, that's disaster recovery. DR, generally a good thing, DR, not so much in data center world. So, so I think, but one thing I covered in terms of globally was more data centers thinking about microgrids. So a lot of data centers is, just have a lot of assets just sitting there just in case of an emergency. Redundancy, some have two different utility feeds. This is not Iceland and Alaska. This is around the world. There was a project in Australia, for example, which had two different utility feeds and a microgrid that was zero carbon technology. They were using some sort of generator. I think it was biofuels and solar and wind and batteries and all that stuff. So, I am a microgrid guy. The whole reason I came to work for Alaska was that I remember Gwen saying when I worked as an analyst that I didn't have enough data about Alaska microgrids, and lo and behold, we discovered that Alaska had more microgrid capacity than any other U.S. state, although most of those are remote systems. We do have a new white paper, which I just posted the link in the chat. We were rushing to get it out today. I noticed a few little things I'd like to clean up, but there is a link there that can be downloaded. And actually, Ellie and Gwen were co-authors on this white paper, which looks at this basically the same issue this whole panel is looking at. How can we learn from Iceland? Can data centers reduce costs for everybody? And so the advantages we identified, and this came actually from the guy in Australia, who said, well, Alaska seems to be a good place for a data center. You have all this free cooling. Of course, we heard about this in Iceland. So, that's obviously one of the main advantages of Alaska is that extreme cold. Now, I've heard people say that cooling might be 5% of a data center's cost. The other folks here probably have more accurate numbers, but it is a factor. And so I would say that's advantage number one. We do have a lot of underutilized capacity. Now in this white paper, we're focused just on the rail belt grid. So we're not talking about the Cordova microgrid data center, which we'll hear from Clay. And I've been talking about that. I guess I'll say I'm presenting next week at the biggest microgrid conference in the world, talking about the Cordova data center with Sam from GreenSpark. But this white paper doesn't talk about those edge data centers. The other advantage is we do have underutilized capacity in the rail belt grid because each microgrid kind of has planned for it to meet its needs almost independently. And so we also heard about the RTO and sort of ideas about maybe eventually being able to share that capacity more easily and perhaps need some new policies. But there is underutilized capacity. Alaska has so much renewable energy. I mean, it's just mind-boggling if you add it all up. I think I would say Alaska has more diverse renewables than any other state in terms of microgrids. You actually have a geothermal microgrid. You have run-of-the-river hydro. There's tidal. There's the kind of wind, solar, etc. So there's a lot of different renewable resources that could serve the rail belt grid. And so you have a lot of untapped renewable energy. So I'd say, those are sort of the main advantages. If you're a microgrid guy like me, you say, well, Alaska has a lot of microgrids. Of course, 100 megawatt data center is going to be hard to fit into the rail belt grid, but I think we're thinking of a more moderate size. But the disadvantage is really the number one disadvantage is, unlike Iceland, Alaska is situated geographically, ideally, to serve Asia Pacific markets. When you kind of look at the world from top down, which I only did, when I started working here, you realize how close it is, but we don't have the connectivity like Iceland does to the European markets to serve some of those loads. We have connectivity to the lower 48, but there's latency issues, which we heard about. So I think the main downside for siting large data centers that would be more of a global provider of data services, we need those fiber optic connections. Then because of that, we have latency constraints on what a data center could do in the rail belt because of the time it takes the data to go back and forth to Seattle or some other place, maybe Silicon Valley. So we couldn't do immediately the ChatGPT type stuff, all the AI hype that's out there. Although I would argue that if Alaska starts building data centers and thinking about the future, maybe serving these other kinds of data processing loads first, and maybe takes a modular approach, eventually those fiber connections will be built, and then we could be positioned. We wouldn't be starting behind. And then the last challenge is the high cost of energy in Alaska itself. Data center operators want low cost power. And so if you're just looking at the electricity rate, as the white paper shows, we do not compare that well to the other top US states. But we also point out that with the cooling, maybe you don't just look at electricity costs, look at the total energy picture and factor in the cooling, and then things would look more attractive. So I'll stop there. So that's my opening statement. Yeah.
It's a good, your comments on the modular approach is a good way to tee up Clay, who's another microgrid guy. And I was curious, Clay, if you could talk a little bit about your work with Green Spark in Cordova, and how that project that you've just moved forward on. That's one of the things I love about you, is you just see things and move. And while a lot of stuff is in the future, you've put something in practice that people can actually visit, and is working today. So how does your work with Green Spark and the project in Cordova make you think about the Alaska opportunity and suggest kind of move forward in Alaska?
Absolutely. And I'd like to, if I could, maybe answer a couple of questions in the chat here in the process.
Sure.
And so Mitch had a question about data center growth and how it impacts other industries. So we kind of came to the data industry organically. And like you said, it looked like quick movement on Cordova Electric's part. We had talked to Green Spark for quite some time. Once we saw their infrastructure and its modularity and the small size, talked a little bit about the energy components and the cooling piece of the equation and how that impacted the overall cost. For Cordova Electric's part, or for Cordova, the community of Cordova's part, very much as Ellie indicated, we're kind of a one-trick pony in terms of our industry. We have a core seafood industry that represents maybe 90% of our economy. So we're looking for ways to diversify our economy. And as our seafood industry is under pressure, we've already built all of the infrastructure, and we have a substantial excess renewable energy available, especially seasonally. So we realize that still that economy of scale, central power, trying to sell as many kilowatt hours as you can to spread your operating costs and keep your rates down is still our best path forward. So we've been looking for years for an industry that could come in and utilize more of that excess renewable energy, create another revenue stream to diversify our economy. So when we saw these two little cabinets that could be, sit on a 12 square foot pad and use 170 kilowatts of energy, we said, we're in. So those were cloud services. And for us, again, we have the capacity and redundancy that we've built into our grid that Peter talked about. So we saw it as a way to sell more energy to actually help support our seafood industry and spread our operating costs and better utilize that capacity that we have. So we recognize that our hydroelectric plants have ice cold water running through them all year. So we did a little co-design with them, installed 2 cloud server cabinets, very high density energy use, and are using the cold water from our pipeline to cool them. Now, we don't have a lot of load there yet because they're cloud services and those have to build up over time. What we're actively developing right now is a small scale AI processing load, which would be a fixed amount of load that's on all the time that can help utilize that excess hydropower, but is a small enough size that, to Christopher's point, it isn't going to disrupt our microgrid and the quality of power. So we have to be very also, it's a good ecosystem here in Cordova because we have all underground power lines and very reliable power. So we can provide some pretty good assurances on constant data throughput. And then on the fiber, there's another question from Matthew here about fiber transmission capacity, and you and Peter had talked to it at some point, but Alaska is actively building $1 billion of fiber build out. There's a lot of new fiber going in. We have 1 fiber out of Cordova. 2 others are being built out of Cordova. 1 over towards Seward to the north, 1 to Juneau to the south. So we're going to have triple fiber redundancy and 2 microwave paths in and out of Cordova. So that connectivity, it's a way to grow sales. So rather than thinking about, gee, what if this forces us to build new fiber, we're building a lot of fiber that we don't really have a lot of traffic on. And so this is a way to help monetize and generate revenues for that telecom industry as well. And then back to the rail belt, this also speaks to an opportunity to, if you have that anchor tenant who can use that capacity and monetize it for you, then you can actually use them as an anchor tenant to maybe help develop some of these fiber and potentially even renewable energy projects, even large scale on the rail belt if you look at Watana's Sitna or maybe someday nuclear or so forth.
Yeah, great. And Clay, thanks for doing my job there. You already answered 2 of the questions on our list here, but I wanted to jump up towards the top. Gary had asked about something that ties Alaska to Iceland, which is volcanoes. And he asked, does volcanic activity impact the operation or risk for development and the location of a data center? And how do you view that? Anyone want to jump in here?
I can. It's a very common question. So we've had 8 or 9 eruptions in just near our international airport, Keflavik, in the past 4 years. This is where the largest portion of data centers are located. The risk there is the infrastructure supplying the data centers. So it's the fiber optics that go around the island and go to the subsea cables. Fortunately, they've not broken during the seismic and volcanic activities. And then it's the power production on geothermal. So geothermal plants are always very close to the plates. So we've had days where we are afraid of our power lines. So it is a risk, but we've learned to live around it, and we build around volcanic and seismic activities. The location in the north is located on more of the most secure sites when it comes to both earth movements and flood risks. Our feature side is, yes, there on a hot area, but we know that BMW, we know that Crusoe Energy has announced that they are there. Nebius, which is a new large AI aggregator. A lot of companies that go in there bluntly saying, yes, we're there, we're happy to be there, and we're not afraid of the risk. And this is done by creating a resiliency infrastructure. So in case if the power line goes out, you have that 2-end deployment. You have 2 power feeds. You might not have a 2 substations, but you have 2 power feeds. And through one of that power feed, you're backed up with generators. It can be biofuel, biodiesel, or it can be hydrogen or methane, depending on how far you want to go into having a or less CO2 footprint on those generators. So we've lived there for more than 1,000 years, and we know how to live in that landscape, and that's how we've survived all those volcanoes for the past 2 decades, and not having our data centers, old ones and new ones, falling out.
Oh, one just quick add-on. Yeah, I did see, and it's referenced in the white paper, that Google cited a big data center in Nevada right by a geothermal facility, because to them it's the attraction of the baseload carbon-free energy, similar to in Iceland. Obviously, though, Nevada is a little warmer than Iceland, so they obviously have to deal with the cooling load. And then one other quick thing is, I was just thinking about the rail belt grid. So the rail belt grid, as I mentioned, is a series of microgrids, different utilities. So I suppose it might be an attractive location for a data center to be served by two different utilities on the rail belt. That might be a spot, because there's sort of the series of them. So that might be a strategy that a data center might find.
And maybe
go ahead, Chris.
May I add? So if we look at Silicon Valley, there are two tectonic plates hitting together, and once they release, there's a shear force that goes out. In Iceland, it's two tectonic plates going in separate directions, so the power is never as much. So we know that the majority of data and a lot of data centers are located in the Silicon Valley. So these are just built to suit whatever location there is. So.
On that topic, I have to give a shout out to a member of our team that just left last week to launch his own startup called Planet Power, which is a local geothermal developer that's really going after this market. So we've even got some local startups that are taking a leap here. Back to the questions, Parrish had asked, does Iceland have to import workers to operate these data centers? Is the workforce skilled enough, and how would the benefit translate to Alaska, which would likely have to import labor?
So in Iceland, we've built up our company for over a decade. So we've attained quite a lot of strong talents that are suitable to train new hires. You get electricians to join. So we've been managed to maintain through local employees only. And in Finland, we've also been able to, but this will become a challenge once we add more capacity, because there will be a bottleneck, and there is a hyperscaler approach. You just go to a country that has a very high education, but very low cost employees, and they are imported into the hyperscaler data centers. Meanwhile, they build up the local trainees for 3 to 5 years, and then they go to the next place, and then you've created your ground team that will operate it for the remaining of the lifetime.
Yeah. Anyone else want to touch on the workforce side of this? All right, moving on. Aaron B asked, per an ADN article, local newspaper, the North Slope has a data center pilot project this winter. There is cheap natural gas on the North Slope. Does the panel believe it is cost effective for a data center to build their own power generator, the turbine, if the gas was cheap enough?
So I can get back on this as well. So in Finland, this is actually quite popular because you can sell into the grid in Finland, while Iceland is a closed monopoly. So data centers are not allowed to use their excess generation into the capacity. So the smart grids have become quite popular, not only in Finland, but in Germany as well. When the electrical prices hit a certain margin where it's cheaper to generate the electricity using whatever alternative fuel, they turn them on and they provide and sell electricity to the grid. That way, they can reduce and pay down the cost and both the capex and opex of the generators and create an additional revenue. So essentially, data centers are no longer just about selling capacity, it's about selling heat and selling the infrastructure to support the local community, either through the microgrid or if there's a high demand. So there's a lot of development ongoing in the data centers, and everyone's trying to find ways to maximize the investment using everything as a revenue generator.
Great. And I'm actually going to, anyone want to jump in? Peter, you came off.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I find that interesting because I remember, like I said, when I went to my first data center conference, which I guess was 2017, I guess that was a while ago. What I kept hearing folks, and I went to several afterwards, is that the irony is the data center industry is creating all of this cutting edge technology, AI, and all the stuff we keep hearing about. But then someone said, yeah, the data center industry likes to use new technologies as long as it's been around for 30 years. That's what the guy was saying. And that's why they were saying they were so attached to their diesel generators and they didn't want to take the risk of shedding load like demand response and stuff. But I think that is starting to change. Just like I said, the conversation about having an actual microgrid with maybe fuel cells and a diverse array of resources. The controls for all that have improved. AI, can improve those kind of operations as well. So I think for the railbelt grid, if these data centers and there were some policy reforms on some more dynamic pricing, like there are, like in Australia, which is kind of the opposite extreme where the price changes every 5 minutes and, it maybe is a little too hyper deregulated. But I think that's another key thing for data centers. If they could be, and I know some of this sounds like it was going on in Iceland, more sort of a flexible load and take advantage, a little bit like the edge data center model when there's extra low cost renewables, soaking that up. Same concept with EV charging that's been talked about here where I'm based in California right now. So I think that's another key thing for data center operations to maybe be more open-minded about how to create revenue streams. Don't view all those assets as just a cost to maintaining resiliency, but you can be resilient, but you can also support the grid and get paid for it. And that's a trend I'd say in the whole microgrid industry, whereas utilities in the lower 48, at least, not in Alaska, we're often opposed to microgrids. We're wary of them, but now that's changed a little bit because, for example, in California, there were a couple times where a microgrid islanded during a wildfire and saved the whole grid from collapsing. Just that shift of 3 or 4 megawatts was enough to keep the grid operating. And so I think the view by maybe large investor-owned utilities of microgrids is a little more that they can be a valuable player in sort of the whole grid ecosystem.
And maybe I can add to that. Data centers was always built not to fail because there was a lot of money in there and you needed to keep it running whatever happened. But like you mentioned, it was always built as long as it had proven to work for many years. And when the war in Ukraine started, there we saw a lot of change because what happened to all these data centers was that energy prices spiked. They closed the gas from Russia into Europe. So data centers were on the brinks of going bankrupt. So they had a lot of challenges. Energy cost 4, 5, 6 times just overnight. So from there onwards, they started looking into more ways on innovation. And there's a very interesting saying that I had with a Microsoft data center designer. He said, we built to fail. The reason is you will always have something that will fail. That's why we create mirror images, because the likelihood of everything in multiple places will fail is a lot better than having one side and you put all your trust in that side instead of doing mirrors around in different locations. And that is what is also an opportunity for data storage. Everything that's not latency intensive is to create a mirror far away from something else, so you always know you have a safe backup. Iceland is a very good place to be. It's a low energy usage, but a lot of revenue. Alaska would also be a very good place for a secondary backup, some place where you won't be pulling that data all day, every day, but you park it there and you can retrieve it on demand.
I'm curious, C. Kennedy had asked a question that I also had, which is the fiber that was laid to support these data centers, were those laid by or paid for by state and federal funds or private sector, or how were those paid for in Iceland?
Oh,
So it's the initial fiber was a cooperation between Iceland and Faroe Islands. So it was two states joining hands.
Interesting.
The second one, Danais, was a partnership between Denmark and Iceland, and then Iris was completely owned and operated by the Icelandic government.
All government
So we have
entities.
Yeah. So there was a entity formed called Farais, which operated the three, and we have one more called Greenland Connect, and that's it's a privately owned fiber. So three government, one private, and on that, if you manage to get a large anchor customer, there are companies out there like Modularity that are laying down private subsea cables for the hyperscalers. So if you get a hyperscaler attention, then you know that they will be laying down those subsea cables to the site. But all the Nordics have been governmentally funded.
So it looks like you were coming off of mute. Did you have something to add?
oh yeah, I wasn't sure where that question was directed, but here in Cordova, one was actually privately funded by our local telephone cooperative, and they generate revenue off of that traffic. The two new ones are part of the federal government funding, but they're daisy chaining and landing at villages in both directions as they make that connection to larger communities. So.
Okay, and then a couple of questions from Mark Lissack. Has anyone considered or factored in the effects on ambient temperature from converting electricity for cooling? Is that an issue that folks are looking at?
Yeah, we've taken a pretty deep dive on those, and I saw there was a question about the water temperatures as well. And it's like any industry. You try to take any part of the value chain that is waste or useless. And Iceland's been superstars at this in the fisheries industry. But if you can turn a cost or liability into an asset, whether monetary or environmentally, then that's a big gain. So, just to kind of put some context around it, at our small hydro site, we actually have to heat the 39-degree water up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit because that's the lowest cooling temperature for the data servers. And then just the air blows through and blows that cold air on. So it's really heating the air in the room, and then the water heats up a little bit. But right now, with the relatively small loads on that server, I mean, you can stand there and fill a glass with the water coming out. So it's not a very high volume of discharge. As we get more load on there, we're going to put a heat exchanger on the outflow and reject that heat into our building. Right now, we're heating it with electric heaters, and we're essentially burning diesel fuel at times of the year to heat that plant. With the data servers there, we want to capture every single little bit of heat and so forth. And of course, we want to return the same temperature water to the creek. So we're very intensely focused on the heat because it costs us 3 times as much to heat our facilities as it does to provide electricity. So, and we're not directly converting electricity to heat. We're using the electricity to drive pumps and stuff to use environmental cooling. And then when the heat is generated from the data centers through their operations, we want to put that heat into a building. We've even run heat loops through the ground to melt snow and everything. Then we don't have to run an expensive and energy-intensive cooling system. And we do the same thing with our diesel plants. We don't run radiators. We run cooling loops all through all of our grounds to melt snow and do useful things to keep our parasitic loads and costs down. So really the net effect on the environment is not a net heat gain. We're using that heat where we can.
Yeah, really interesting. Let's see here. And I think you addressed the question that Mark had about water temperatures as well. I'm curious, a bit of a different angle here. Iceland is a wonderful country and beautiful, and I loved my visit. I also noticed that there's essentially a road that goes around the entire island, and I'm curious about how you think about site security and how you keep these assets secure. Is that something that you're worried about in Iceland? And everything seems very accessible, whereas in Alaska we have some natural barriers because you have to fly into places, and most of the state is not connected by a road. Maybe a bit of a random question, but any thoughts on that? Site security?
Yeah, you're talking about public security.
Yeah.
Yeah, Icelanders are a bit, some would say, naive when it comes to, threats of terrorism or some sort of those things. We even don't have an intelligence service or the police is not doing such kinds of stuff. So no, I would not. I do not recollect anybody actually having worries about those. But we have disruptions. We have optical cables that are being taken down, but they're mainly accidentally. People build. My friend is building a new house in the municipality called Selfoss here, just hour from Reykjavik, and he took down, I think, this thick pile of optical cables with his excavator. So I think there are more instances like that accidentally.
I can talk to the.
Go ahead, Christopher. I was just going to say it's interesting, Isaac. You were there in October of 2023. I had a chance to visit with Ellie and others in 2024, and they were actually building data centers and whatnot. And one of the things is we had a chance to tour one of those was not so much the external security, but I'm sure Christopher could talk to this, but the security on site and some of the provisions they had there.
Yeah, so data center security is a real threat. So a single H100 box, it's a one piece of equipment from NVIDIA costs $300,000. Now that's a lot of money. Now you add 4 into a one rack, and you multiply that with 264 to get 1 unit. These are multi-million-dollar investments, and you build not one building, you build 10, 12 buildings of this. So all the data centers in Iceland follow the tiering by Uptime Institute and the ISO standards, and sometimes they go even further into other security standards. Because we've seen back in 2017, 2018, we were naive. We decided not to put up fences for one of the data centers. And of course, there is someone that sees value in getting an easy access to because this is in the end a lot of value. So all data centers in Iceland, to get a confirmation if they're running sensitive loads, they need to have a 4-level security. That's a 24/7 network operating center, so it's 24 surveillance. Usually there's one person on site the full day. So even though Iceland is the most secure country by some list, we really take security very, very seriously, and we don't want to fall asleep while on guard while we are operating. These are all from transactions to very, very sensitive information.
Just wanted to remind folks who are online, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll make sure to ask them here. We have a few minutes left. I'm also curious if you could speak to, I mean, it's a good problem to have that you have all sorts of industrial load and, aluminum plants and other, carbon sequestration and large industrial players that would like to tap into Iceland's cheap, stable energy. What is that process like within the country to prioritize which projects get to integrate into the transmission grid? And is that something that's handled? Is there an IRP and a resource planning process that the transmission operator deals with, or how does that process work? Like who gets to tie in?
Yeah, I can take this one. Well, in the previous panel, Gwen Holtman from ASAP showed us a picture of Kárahnjúkar Dam, the largest hydro generating site in Iceland, 690 megawatts, and simultaneously they built out a large smelter to take most of that energy. That was, as I touched on a bit before, that was a painful process for the nation, it tear the nation pretty much apart. But no one doubts that it was a economically and a wise project for the community to take on and for the nation to take on. Not questioning that, but it actually left a big hole, or a motive, or I haven't done any research on it, and just speculations of what people are talking with me about that. There has been a lack of further building out further generation in Iceland for now almost 20 years, because of, some say it because of that project, because it was such a difficult thing. Also, there's another aspect to it as well, and that is that I presented briefly on how electrical generation had always been built out in context with the heavy industry sector, in context with a big smelter. There was a smelter and there is a generation. This has been the story in Iceland for quite some time. And now Iceland actually has to build out new generation for a load that is pretty unknown. You cannot pinpoint with your finger that, okay, this factory will consume 100 megawatts, because Iceland is now building out load for energy transition. And if you speak to anybody that is selling energy in Iceland, at the state energy company or municipality-owned companies, they could probably sell, 50% more energy within reasonable time. And then if you look at the other end, the data centers or industry, e-fuel sector, or whatever, there is significant demand of energy in Iceland. Iceland has been doing somewhat better with building out more transmission capacity, but not entirely. There has been a 20-year fight over a lack of transmission. I think it's only 10 kilometers or something like that. It's not very long here in the Reykjanes Peninsula, and it took 20 years to solve it. In some cases, the state has been pretty firm with acquiring land. Law is in that way in Iceland that the state can actually acquire a land and just pay for it a reasonable price to use it for such projects, but they have been sometimes pretty reluctant to act on that pretty firmly. But I can be pretty confident in saying that there is all the energy in Iceland has been sold out. There has been loss of revenue because of lack of transmission improvements, though they are pretty seldom. But this is a fact of changes in weather conditions. For example, the reservoirs here in the South Highlands have not been filling up as much as they did before. Though if you ask an Icelander, there's always wind or rain here. So why they're not filling up, there are probably other reasons for that.
Yeah, I can also speak a little bit from my point of view, because we are a buyer from the monopoly market. So as you may know, the transmission owner is a state-owned, and the largest energy producers are also state-owned. And in law, it was written you can't resell electricity into the grid. You needed to be a state-owned. But we've seen cases where there is the possibility to generate small 10 megawatts, 5 megawatts, small energy production that they've managed to sell into the energy production companies, even if they're state-owned, and then they can sell it to the market. Just a few months ago, it was opened up that there is an investigation for 2 years to see the interest of selling more electricity into the grid. We got Norwegian companies wanting to build large windmill farms, et cetera, the moment we opened up the doors. But to Erlinger's point, in Iceland, we finished Kárahnjúkavirkjun, but there were a lot of other hydro stations on the agenda. And we have been building more geothermal wells to create geothermal power. But we've had a mixture of, from my point of view, of conservatives, nature conservatives, and people that want to go and create more revenue. And for the past 8 years, we've had a mix of these parties, and they've never been able to agree to see the benefits of using energy. My point of view is that why don't you create energy where you can when it's green? We've done this for so many years, and if you can reduce the use of other non-renewable energy somewhere else in the world, you should. Because if we don't create it, someone else will go burn oil somewhere else. So what has happened in the market is the Icelandic energy is no longer cheapest in Europe. We're actually reached the point we're on par with Finland, or even more expensive than Finland. We're more expensive than north of Norway. And that is because we've been overselling our capacity and to a point where we have seen that the uses of our reservoirs have been depleting, where it was in the interest of national security to stop selling electricity to some of the large consumers, for the simple reason that they always thought that we would have finished a new dam or a new generation by that time. It was stopped due to arguments. It was a landowner or someone that didn't. So we're to the point where we would have been able to allocate the hyperscalers. We could have had Google, we could have had AWS, or we could have had Microsoft. But these policies from the government actually put a halt on these big companies coming to Iceland, because they feel it's uncertain if the energy production will be there in the future or not. So it's very important that going into the future is there will be a common mind on where the state or the country is going, because that will provide trust for large industries to invest in the country to generate more revenues and more diverse revenues. Because, for example, now we don't know what will happen to the price of aluminium, meaning that there could be a large hit on the demand of electricity on the smelters, because it just simply flows with the request of the world price of aluminium. So it's a large economical market, and small changes in the market can have such a drastic demand due to the price of fish, due to the price of aluminium. But we know that electricity is usually something that is a competitive advantage everywhere in the world. And on a market that's growing so fast, data centers is a good place to be at the moment. Who knows what will happen in 20 years, but predictions tell us that this is something that will continue developing and will be a demand for as long as we continue evolve.
Yeah, I have to tell you, from an Alaskan's perspective, it's what a great problem to have, that you almost have too much industry, and you're having to keep some of the industry away just because you don't have the capacity yet. And what a great lesson also in terms of, if we can have cheap, low cost clean energy, what that can attract. I mean, that's the main lesson from Iceland, I think, from certainly my trip back in 2023.
But yeah, we've to the point that the price of electricity is no longer a burden for consumers. Of course, it's an attraction point, but electricity, having vacant electricity, is now what is the market is after.
Yeah, fascinating. On the policy front and role of government, Parrish had asked, how can the state, I think here he means the state of Alaska, work with municipalities to attract data center investment? Are there barriers, things that the state can be doing? And again, feel free to jump on this, our friends in Iceland or Clay or Peter, things that you think that the state could be doing to attract investment.
I can jump on. If we would, as we are talking about Iceland, and that is the overarching topic of today and tomorrow, is that what Iceland did is that they established a business development center, that or an entity that was solely mandated to attract load to Iceland, load growth to Iceland, or off-takers to Iceland. I think they were mandated to look mainly into the aluminium smelters, but I really don't know. But that is at least what came out of it. But they worked actively to both enlarge the smelters, the two smelters that we had here already, and they worked actively in attracting the big one in the east. So what Alaska can do, maybe you can try to go that way.
Yeah. And anything to add there, Clay, coming off mute?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to answer. This is an emerging industry. It's a huge opportunity. To Christopher's point, I mean, if I uncover my background here, there's in the size of this room that I'm sitting in, it's 12 feet by 20 feet. You can put $20 million of data processing equipment. That's about a 300 kilowatt load. So that is a huge investment in a small community's economy, and it generates a lot of revenue for your telecom, for your electric utility. This is extremely it's a large magnitude opportunity. And I think it's something that the state does really need to be looking at, and communities need to be looking at, because there's opportunities here again with an anchor tenant. If you just think of it as an industrial customer who's coming in and willing to make a big investment, they can help develop renewable energy projects that maybe otherwise aren't available, or extend broadband, as Christopher was mentioning, to their resources. So it's a big opportunity, and I think we need to be intentional about it. And again, look at all those little pieces of the value stream. If you're delivering electricity via natural gas, how can we use the excess heat there? How can we get the best value for our communities and citizens and states? And it's a huge opportunity. I think we should be answering those questions.
Yeah, well said. And I'll have to save the best question for last year that KZ asked, which is, will Christopher and Erlinger be able to attend the conference here in Anchorage in June? So can you guys commit on the record here to coming to Alaska?
I'm happy to join.
All right. You heard it here, folks.
But
I was last year. It would be great to come again. It was a great conference.
It is.
So maybe from a buyer's perspective, there are 3 points that needs to be existing for a data center to come. It's a plot that's been allowed for a zone plot for data center industry. It needs to be close to a substation, and it needs to be close to at least a redundant fiber path. These are the 3 main things that is enough for a data center to kick off and start off. So it's basically, and what we've seen so much in Europe is these small plots are coming up everywhere. Wherever there's a substation, there seems to be an vacant plot, and now that's being zoned for data center industry. So if you have that and create a data centers by Alaska, or create some kind of initiative and push that out either privately or through the public, that way you can gain the traction, because from my point of view, there should be no barriers for Borealis to come into Alaska, because you fill out all of our requirements. So
That's great.
having a plot ready would.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And with that, and Christopher, thank you for joining us. In Erlinger, I know it's about 8:15 in Iceland right now. And thank you all to all of our panelists for this exciting conversation. And I'll sign off here and hand it back to the event organizers.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Isaac, for that moderation. So as promised, today we did do a deep dive into the similarities and differences between Alaska and Iceland, and we explored what Alaska can learn from Iceland's innovation. I'm taking away so many thoughts on the practical realities, the future opportunities, the long lead times needed to make these changes. And I think one of the most resonant parts of today's conversation is the foresight and the commitment needed to move Alaska into the future. We appreciate all the incredible presenters and yourselves, the virtual attendees that participated in today's workshop. If you learned something new today, encourage your friends and colleagues to join us tomorrow. You can see what we'll be covering tomorrow on the screen below. So we'll be looking again at innovation economy, and the secret sauce reimagined for Alaska. Again, thank you all for joining us on the first day of Building Alaska's Future, Insights from Iceland, hosted by Alaska Center for Energy and Power. We look forward to seeing you all back here again tomorrow at 8:30 Alaska or 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Have a great afternoon or evening, and thank you